Hi and welcome. Today we are joined by Dr. Andrew Fear, a historian at the University of Manchester. Andrew is one-of-a-kind scholar who has spent his career at the sharp end of the Roman Empire. He possesses a ridiculously deep well of knowledge that ranges from high strategy down to the granular daily grit of a legionary on the wall. He is the author of Rome and Baetica, a definitive investigation into how a contested war zone transforms into a central imperial province. Whether he is decoding the ink on a Vindolanda scrap of wood or the epigraphy on a fragment of stone, Andrew's work is marked by an overflowing enthusiasm for primary evidence. He has a unique ability to reconstruct an entire logistical strategic apparatus from these tiny pieces of data. So Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much. That's far too kind, but let's see where we go anyway.
So you grew up in the north of England, surrounded by a lot of the physical remnants of the Roman presence. So before we get into strategy, I was wondering if that played a part in why you decided to pick the sort of periphery of the empire as your topic of interest.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I suppose I've always gravitated towards the slightly unusual. So rather than big politics at Rome, so to speak, little politics and the edge of empire, and also the way that different cultures interact with each other, either in a friendly or very often not so friendly way, has also been appealing. I suppose, a very, very early present for me as a child, probably when I was about 7 or 8, was a small picture book which was about prehistoric and Roman Britain, and my favourite page, childish as it may seem, was actually an Iron Age lake village, but rapidly followed by the Picts overrunning Hadrian's Wall. So those two things were there. I did grow up in Lancaster. Lancaster has a few Roman remains, a little bit of a 4th century fort there, some nice stones from the earlier fort. About 20 years ago, of course, not my childhood, as everyone can see, I'm much older than that. A very, very interesting large Roman tombstone of a man who was in the Roman army but was a headhunter and proudly is seen with a head for his collection on his tombstone. But I guess actually my earliest introduction to frontiers in the Roman world was the fact that I had relatives sadly now passed away in Carlisle. And at that time, the town library, when you went in through a corridor absolutely lined with Roman stones, complete with nice parallel transcriptions and translations from Hadrian's Wall. And that really did capture my imagination. And I've sort of been floating around in that part of the world ever since.
You're quite involved in epigraphy, and is that maybe something that's dragged you into epigraphy? Because you've got both the Roman, you've got both the Latin and the translation right there as a kid, which sort of...
Yeah, no, for me it was great. So this was when I was in my early mid-teens. I was just starting to learn Latin. I was very lucky. The grammar school in Lancaster taught Latin all the way through in those days. Sadly now I think it's down to the 6th form. But yeah, I could go up there, I could look at these tombstones, and I could test my Latin by looking at the transcription and then having a look at the translation afterwards to see if I got it right. So, I mean, these were classes for free, and they were fun because they were just interesting things.
So I was hoping we could talk a little bit about the Roman Empire and on its edges. And to do that, we have to some degree talk about territory and edges or zones of influence, etc. I was wondering if the best way to conceptualize these sort of peripheral regions is in sort of zones of power projection or varying degrees of ability for a said power to kind of project itself, as opposed to talking about hard borders or, like people sometimes envision Hadrian's Wall as that kind of hard edge of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, so I think we've got to be careful here in two sorts of ways. I mean, one is certainly this is not Game of Thrones territory. There isn't a giant wall to keep out the zombies and nobody's meant to go through the wall. Most Roman frontiers are fairly porous. There are attempts, particularly in the 2nd century, I would say in the Danube, to make those frontiers very much harder. And even on Hadrian's Wall, arguably, we start with a very porous frontier, and very soon steps are taken to make that little bit harder. Nonetheless, I think, we can throw out the baby with the bathwater. So it has become awfully fashionable in some circles to talk about the Romans not having frontiers, that there are only zones and such like this. This is just isn't true, is it? You know whose country you lie in because the state takes your money. It's called taxation, license theft, and the guys who are coming to take the money, you're in their territory. So there is a hard edge to the world. That's not to say there isn't then a softer zone of influence, and I think again people forget, everybody remembers it about the Byzantines, but of course the Byzantines call themselves Romans and indeed were Romans. That soft power projection, quiet diplomacy is as much part of how the Romans guard their frontiers as doing it with soldiers. But I do think that there is a frontier. People know where it is because, as I say, that's the men who come to take your money, and you know which side of the frontier you lie. If you're not having money taken from you, you're not in that state, are you?
I think that's a very useful kind of counterpoint to how a lot of people try and knock down the idea of a hard border, because like you say, if someone's coming to take your money and then they're not, that's almost a kind of idea of a hard border in terms of administrative. In the same way that in the modern day, you've got the hard US border and then you have zones of influence of US power, but they're not collecting taxes from you. So there's that kind of differentiation. But the idea of this is US territory, this is where we collect our taxes still exists. And I guess that's sort of, in some analogous way, similar in the past. Would you say that where they're building these forts is very close to where that hard border might be? Or would you say that maybe the forts are, to some degree, in friendly territory, in a place which is safer, and that actually they're probably collecting taxes quite a bit to the north, if we're talking about Hadrian's Wall or further out from the centre?
Yeah, so I think, again, interesting in a way that in Britain, the major bases for legions as opposed to smaller units lag some way behind the frontier. There is a moment after Agricola has got up to somewhere near Aberdeen, nobody knows quite where, but immediately afterwards there is an attempt to build a large legionary fortress in the lowlands of Scotland, a place called Inchtoothil. Sadly, nothing to see there now, although I am the proud possessor of 3 Roman nails from Inchtoothil. They found over 750,000 nails there, so this is no great achievement in that respect. But yeah, that is quite interesting because as the Romans then slowly roll back over the next 20 years or so to the line where Hadrian's Wall is going to be constructed, we don't see any more movement. So the bases remain at Chester, they remain at York. On the other hand, on the continent, those bases tend to be much closer to the frontier, on the Rhine and on the Danube. So arguably, whether it's just circumstances or whether there's some deeper thought behind that, there is a little bit of a difference there. As regards Hadrian's Wall itself, there are outlying bases occupied in the lowlands of Scotland, but I think those are outside of the empire. So there, I think what you've got are a series of bits of power projection. Little bit like, if you like, the US base, taking your analogy, on Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. The US doesn't tax the Cubans, but they have the base there. I think that places like Birrens and High Rochester in the lowlands of Scotland are in the same line. So I think there is a hard line. It is Hadrian's Wall. There is then a soft zone of power projection, but I think civil administration stops where the wall stops.
And when you talk about this kind of rolling back, so they have they kind of go forward and then they roll back, does it make sense to you that this is orderly? Because obviously if you're a little village and suddenly one day the Romans are collecting taxes and the next day they're not, is there any sort of orderly way that these things happen, or is it just a matter of one day the Romans come knocking and saying we're collecting taxes and then they just don't show up the next day?
I think the withdrawal from Scotland, which I think is something that hurts the Romans quite a bit. The Romans don't like giving up territory. After all, the Emperor Hadrian is one of those curious emperors. Most emperors who were regarded as good in antiquity have retained that reputation in the modern world, and bad ones as well. I mean, one thinks about people like Caligula, for example, still regarded as a bad guy. A few have changed. Claudius, I think Robert Graves did a huge PR plus for him, and the BBC, of course, again, what part of my childhood, did another nice PR plus for him on the telly. Series, actually, I think, still worth watching. I mean, it's one of those things from the past where you can revisit and enjoy it. But Hadrian, although now regarded as a sort of good guy, was detested in antiquity. And one of the reasons, I think, for that detestation was the giving up of territory. In Scotland, we have withdrawal almost immediately, so that the great legionary base at Inchtoothill is never finished. The Romans seem to have pulled away from it within about 3 years of their victory near Aberdeen. On the other hand, the demolition of Inchtoothill was systematic. Those nails I talked about were buried carefully to stop the locals finding them very successfully. They weren't found until the 20th century. So there, I think there is a slow, steady withdrawal. Now, whether that withdrawal got worse towards the end is an interesting question. After all, one of the things I think that is hard to do militarily is to do an orderly retreat. Things can go wrong very quickly and in unexpected ways. So there is contested evidence from a place called Newstead, where bones have been found, which may be bones of people who've just been done in as Rome crumbles. On the other hand, that the nature of those bones has been interpreted sometimes as, again, the deposition of trophies rather than actual just bones of victims. And there is also fairly recently discovered at Vindolanda a broken stone. There's only half of it left, which looks potentially, although I think there are problems with the interpretation. I mean, as ever within epigraphy, when you've got a broken stone, all sorts of interesting things can happen. But of a centurion who may have been killed in a war, if that's the correct way of reading the stone, which would be just before the building of Hadrian's Wall. So I think what starts probably as a very orderly withdrawal, mainly I think through manpower pressure. It's not, I think, that the Scots are, well, we shouldn't call them Scots, of course, but I think you know what I mean. They're particularly tough compared to other barbarians. It's simply there aren't enough soldiers to go round. But of course, success breeds success, or perceived success if you're a Scotsman of this sort. And of course, failure can breed failure, can't it? So once things start going backwards, sometimes it can be very hard to stop them.
I'm quite interested in the process on both sides, and I guess we can use Spain as a good place to look at these things, but both how the Romans take over a territory, how that transforms from being a frontier to an actual province where they're collecting taxes, and that whole process, and then potentially in the reverse. But the reason I thought Spain was quite an interesting example for these things is because Spain, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to occupy every category of Roman issue. It's kind of this exploratory province, then they have, I guess the closest of what you can say would be a very hard border, because they have another superpower in the same territory, and they're buffing up against each other. So there you would probably have, to my mind at least, something much more akin to what we would call a border today, where on the one side it's Rome and the other side you have clear Carthaginian influences or whatever. Then later the Carthaginians are kicked out, but they still have resistance, and then it becomes this central part of the empire. Is that a fair way of looking at the various stages of the Spanish?
Spain's tricky in the sense that it's even to this day, it's a much more varied area than our own country. So when one looks at Andalusia, the area that becomes Baetica, the area running up to Cartagena, and places, even Barcelona, such like the Mediterranean coast, I think you're dealing with a rather different world from the world of the central Meseta of Spain. And that too is very different from Galicia, Asturias, that more northerly, very much more Celtic type area. So Rome, I think, deals with these people in different ways, not least because they are organised in a different way themselves. In Baetica, along the Med in general, you get populations who are living an urban lifestyle. That the way they organise themselves is comprehensible to the Romans. They're not doing it exactly the same, obviously, but they're coming out the same sort of box. When you get to the middle and you get to the north in particular, you're dealing with a much more fragmented, decentralised sort of society. And I think the Romans find that very much harder to get a handle on because it's just not the way they do things. And arguably, as far as they're concerned, it's not the way human beings should be doing things at all. And that makes life very much more difficult. So in terms of borders, yes, obviously, at the very early period of the peninsula's history, we do have first Phoenicians and then, of course, Carthaginians acquiring an area there. Why the Second Punic War kicks off is probably worth a long discussion in and of itself. But we see Rome overrun those bases. That's quite important because it cuts Hannibal off from any form of supply. What the locals thought of that, I think, is a very interesting question. My guess is actually most of the locals would just wish both of these ones would just go away and leave them alone. Unfortunately, Spain is very rich in mineral resources. The Sierra Morena has large amounts of silver in it, for example. There's also tin down there, of course, Huelva, we all know about Rio Tinto and all the rest of it. So the Romans decided that they'd stay. And they actually managed to grab most of Baetica without much resistance at the end of the day. Life gets much harder as they push further westwards, in a more northerly direction. I think that's because, again, they find it harder to deal with the groups of people out there. But also, of course, this is the period where Rome, we move into the late Republic in particular, has an awful lot on her own plate. So the length of time it takes the Romans to conquer Spain has as much, I think, to do with Roman internal politics and structural difficulties there as it does with the strength and prowess of the opposition that she faces on the peninsula.
So I think the point you made about them having issues dealing with these sort of semi-nomadic peoples, this is something that they have quite often, especially in the more barbaric parts of the empire, so less Asia but more Europe. And this puts them at a kind of, in a sense, a psychological disadvantage or some kind of tactical disadvantage on the battlefield, maybe analogous to the Americans in Afghanistan or something like that, where is there some kind of progression of the way the Romans learn to deal with these peoples, and do they learn from one region about how to deal with another with regards to how their mindset is in relation to the people that they're trying to conquer?
That's a very interesting question. It's one that's hard in some ways to answer. I mean, maybe one would say that perhaps institutional learning, if that's what you want to call it, is better in the imperial period than the republican period. Republican period, we have generals who are cycling very rapidly. We have soldiers who, towards the end, are what we could call, I suppose, semi-professional. But, prior to that, again, soldiers who come and then they go. Perhaps in that respect, not so much America and Afghanistan, but America and Vietnam might be an interesting analogy to play with a little bit. It has been said, hasn't it, that America wasn't in Vietnam for 10 years. America was 10 times in Vietnam for 1 year. In other words, again, because of the cycling system, there was no institutional knowledge. Things didn't bed down in the way that perhaps they could have done otherwise. Another problem, I think, for the Romans in particular, is the nature of the society that they're dealing with. So, by and large, the great trick of the Roman Empire is to get the people the Romans conquer to rule themselves on behalf of the Romans. And you do that, of course, by offering the people at the top of the tree a cut. There's got to be something in it for them as well. If you don't have a stable group of people you can cut a deal with, that makes life very much more difficult.
And we see that happening with us in Spain, particularly in the Republican period. Is the Marian reforms a kind of tipping point for this kind of institutional knowledge?
Well, the Marian reforms are a process, aren't they, rather than a thing, I think it's fair to say. Some of them, of course, are happening quite early, and you can see them in Spain. So if one was to look at the siege camps at Numancia, for example, you can see the slow change to the cohortal system of the Roman army, seemingly embedded in the barracks in those siege camps, which spectacularly, because this is part of Spain where there are very few people in many respects, are still there out in the fields to go and have a look at. I think after that, another problem for Rome is that as they move to the harder parts of Spain, the terrain is much worse. People forget that after Switzerland, Spain is the hilliest part of Europe. Yeah, I say we all have the little things about the rain in Spain, etc., etc. But and there are plains, but there are also, even in the south, really spectacular sorts of mountains. It's one of the reasons why in the Middle Ages you don't get the heavy cavalry that you get in Northern Europe. You get jinetes, light cavalrymen who are still nobles, because this is the way you have to fight in those circumstances. Roman soldiers are designed for fighting on nice flat pieces of ground, and most of their tactics work best in those regards. Over time, of course, in the Republican period, we see the hiring of local people. Caesar is very keen on hiring German cavalrymen, for example, in his wars in Gaul. These guys are happy to fight for whoever pays them most. They're not particularly Roman in that respect. Later, of course, in the Imperial period, we get a whole set of auxiliary troops who bring specialised skills to the Roman army that the army doesn't have. Over time, I suppose this is inevitable with bureaucratisation, those troops in their turn become hardened. Most of them wind up looking quite like Roman legionaries in the way that they fight. And as that gap opens, we get more irregular troops, usually called numeri, coming in, who perhaps once again supplement that to make that more irregular side of warfare important. And I think in quite a lot of these theatres in the north and west, those sorts of irregular fighters are going to be quite important.
Oh, that's quite strange. So the auxiliaries end up becoming more like the Romans instead of the Romans learning from the auxiliaries because you would assume, especially from the time of the Second Punic War, when they are fighting in these kind of hillier terrains and they're consistently then having to, because the empire sort of widens out, that the Roman Empire, in some ways like a modern army, would have a detachment or a kind of corps that was particularly adept, who you'd call up on and say, right, we've got some mountainous terrain, get your skis on, this is snowy terrain, time to get out there. Instead, you kind of describe the opposite process, where the auxiliaries, who have these newer skills, end up becoming more like the Romans, and in some ways flatter-footed.
Yeah, I think in some ways that's right. There are various troops in the auxilia, but most auxiliaries, and this is where literature can be frustrating about the Roman army. We always sort of are told that the legionaries are sort of, if we want to use a Napoleonic analogy, and again there are some pluses and some minuses in doing that. The legionaries are sort of the standard line infantrymen, but the auxiliaries are the sort of sharps of this world and sort of whiz around and such like. Well, these guys have big shields. They're wearing chainmail. I don't know if you've ever worn chainmail, but you won't be whipping up a hillside wearing it, because it's heavy. I think because the Roman army is a bureaucratic structure, there is an argument that says that effectively the Roman state is the Roman army. That almost inevitably things that get sucked into it and are regularised rather than simply hired as mercenaries are going to start to be standardised. That, of course, means that they are, as you put it, a little bit more flat-footed. That opens up gaps, but at that point, the hiring of, or the forcible incorporation of units into the Roman army, of people who fight in different ways, starts to fill that gap again. So I don't think the Romans are ever entirely short of these people. Another thing perhaps that we should think about is classical prejudice. So the Iliad is the defining work I think it's fair to say, of how you should fight, what a proper soldier is like. And that means getting up close and personal and battering somebody's brains out with a sharpened iron bar. Yep, that's how you should do it. Missile weapons are always sneaky. The guy who breaks the truce in the Iliad is an archer. The most dubious of all Homeric heroes, Odysseus, uses the bow. Therefore, to some degree, skirmishing missile weapons, I think, are seen as dishonourable. And again, one of the things I think is important with military history is that we can't disembed military formations from the culture that generates them. So if you live in a culture which says that close formation infantrymen fighting each other up close and personal is the way you should do it, there is going to be a direction of travel.
Well, which way does it go? Is it that the culture follows the practical, or the practical follows the culture? Because there might be quite a practical reason for looking at someone with a missile as sneaky. I mean, the same nowadays. There's much less responsibility that gets put from a man who presses a button on a US drone from 1,000 miles away than there is if someone's holding a gun and shooting someone. And the same with the Homeric stories, where the person who breaks the truce has a kind of deniability because he's far from the line. He's not having to step forward and make a big presence of himself. So there might be some practicality to that, and maybe the culture follows the practicalities as opposed to the other way around.
No, there's always going to be a dialectic between these things. But, when one looks at ancient warfare, one looks at ancient Greece to change our part of ancient history for a moment, it makes absolutely no sense to fight in a hoplite formation in Greece, which is a hilly, mountainous area with lots and lots of broken land, but the social structures of Greek city-states require people to do that. The other thing, of course, which is sometimes said of the medieval world as well, isn't it, is that the problem with relying on light troops is it allows the hoi polloi rather too much say in things. If you're rich, one of the things that defines you as a ruler is you can afford the kit, the way that society fights. If all you need is a pointy stick or a sling and a few stones, then everyone can be at the top of the tree. And people who are at the top of the tree are never keen on that sort of thing. So, again, if we think about our own armies, the idea of individual soldiers skirmishing, using their own initiative, is not that deep-bedded. In the 19th century, people are still fighting. The British Army is still using the square as a formation, for heaven's sake, at the end of the 19th century. Now, there, of course, you're quite right. There will come a point where practicalities simply can't be ignored. In that case, it was the machine gun. Yep. There's no point in having close formation if the other side's got a machine gun. You have to change at that point. But by and large, although perhaps there are some pinch points in the ancient world, there's nothing quite as severe as that.
Well, if we stick with this Greek detour for a second, as far as I understood it, the elites didn't like the idea of the hoplite formation because it kind of equalized the battlefield. You didn't have your heroes anymore. You couldn't have your elites. So it might have been in the interest of the elites not to have a hoplite formation, to keep it more loose, so they could still, in some ways, hold their kind of hero status. Because I know there is a big disagreement about whether hoplites helped usher in some of the more democratic elements of the Athenian experiment, etc., because everything became kind of equalized, because no one could take that kind of hero role in the military. How would that fit into this?
Yeah, I think in at one level you're right. The problem is, of course, that the hoplite formation itself, on its own terms, and those terms are quite narrow terms, is infinitely better than skirmishing heroes. You ain't going to win that way, and therefore you will have to change. The comfort, I suppose, in that is it allows in a group of people of lesser wealth, and there are more of them, but owning a big brass cuirass, helmet, and all the rest of it still costs money. So it's not the great leveler that you might have had if you were just given over to skirmish warfare. which would be far more suitable for most of Greece at the end of the day. So, as I say, I think there is a dialectic here. Societies are set up in certain ways, and they like to preserve their social order in the way that they fight militarily. The military side of any society is not completely divorced from the rest of it, but grim determination of things will happen. The most ghastly and spectacular example, I would say, will be the Great War, where, a set of generals who simply are living in the past meet modern weapons, and for a very, very long time, for some of them I fear never, don't wake up to these simple facts, but in the end the simple fact will win out. I think the machine gun is one of those so-called revolutions in military affairs. Nothing can be the same afterwards, and these things happen from time to time. I think, Philip of Macedon turning Greek warfare on its head by emphasising cavalry as opposed to infantry is another of those moments, and then it's for the other side to wake up to what's going on in this regard. Whether that's ever true of Rome, I think, is an interesting question, but certainly going back to what you were saying about sort of the heroic and such like, I think some of these Germanic, Celtic societies where that style of warfare seems to be the norm, coming up against Roman formations, not only in terms of the way that those formations fought, and certainly far more effective on the field of battle than people just rushing around, but also the psychological fact that, if you were on the other side and you looked at the Roman army, you would realise that pretty much every soldier facing you had more kit and better kit than your leader, let alone you. So those two things, I think, do matter.
So if we bring this back to the Roman Republican period, you talked about the Roman army as a kind of administrative entity. At what point does it become administrative? And also, to what degree is it so? Like, do we have the idea of a deep state where there's this permanent kind of bureaucracy behind the scenes which holds institutional knowledge, which keeps things together? Or is it a more two-dimensional army where the people who are there are the institutional knowledge, and it's just the length of time that they're there which they're able to pass on this kind of...
Again, I think we should probably think of both of those things happening. So the high watermark, I suppose, of the primitive ancient world was the 1970s. So we think of, say, Moses Finley's book, The Ancient Economy, so trying to argue that the ancient world had no notion of economic concepts and such like. Now, I think those days have long since gone. I think in the same way, we should remember that there probably is institutional knowledge in the Roman world, where Romans, even in the Republican period, know how long people have served in the army, whether they're due to serve again or such like. So there is a bureaucracy there. We know there are daily roll calls. We've got some of them, of course, from the Imperial period. So we know that there's information about the number of troops, about who's where at any given point in time. Now, of course, there's another question, isn't there? So, the base commander locally knows all of these things. Is that information then being percolated up to the next hierarchy? Does the local legionary commander know what the state of all the local auxiliary troops are like? Does the provincial governor know that about the legions and the auxiliaries and such like? It's hard, I think, for us to know. I find it difficult to think that the Roman army didn't have those information structures. There's certainly, of course, a postal system. We know from the Vindolanda tablets that troops are moving around from one base to another on a fairly regular basis. Most of that seems to be about trade and such like, but it's hard not to think that running alongside that there isn't an information system going on at the same time. There is, of course, an enormous argument about whether there are military professionals, the so-called viri militares, at the top of the system, and that remains a live debate. Once again, I just wonder whether we should be thinking about perhaps something like the 18th century, where we don't have professionalism or a deep state, if you like, in the way that you've talked about, but we don't have nothing either. and that you have people from the aristocracy who would not like to be thought of as professionals in any sense, but nonetheless people who, if you like, this was their hobby, so they took more interest in it than the average member of their social class, and they thought more about it. Underneath that, I suppose, you also have in the Roman period that group of people in the centuriate, particularly the senior centuriate, who are there for a long time. They do possess institutional knowledge. It is a system which renews itself on a regular basis, so there is an ability for new people to come in to be told what's going on by older people. Also, these people are on a wage which makes them able to interact with aristocrats who come in a socially respectable way. So again, I think you would have to be very careful with some people who came in who thought that they knew it all. But you can see a world, can't you, where a senior centurion goes aside to a rather younger military tribune and says, are you sure you want to do that, sir? And in those contexts, actually, it may be listened to. There is no loss of face in listening to such a person because they are, at least in terms of finances, in a sort of socially respectable area. So, I don't think we need to go for an all or nothing here. I think, as time has evolved, we've no need to see the Romans as an ultra-modern state, but we've no need to see them as a particularly primitive group of people with no state at all. I think there is a sort of middle way at that point.
Well, seeing as you mentioned the kind of flow of information, that's just kind of triggered the idea that obviously how the flow of information worked is something else we can discuss maybe later in terms of battle tactics and spying, etc. But there must have been some kind of parallel system, at least for the money. So that might be worth kind of following exactly how and where money was coming from, because that flow of information from the bottom to the top, someone was paying for everyone to be there. And so in some respects, there's got to have been some kind of back office communicating a lot of this information. There must have been writing documents and all this kind of stuff. Again, this is just me kind of guessing here, but as well for the flow of as soon as you've got the flow of information when it comes to people, you also surely are going to want to know exactly what's going on the front, especially if you're not there, if you're maybe a commander that's far behind. And surely there was some kind of system with all this going on, and that kind of could play into that.
No, I think that's got to be right. So I think, if you're a provincial governor, you will want to know what's happening in your province, not least because if it goes wrong, it's your neck that's going to be on the block. So you would expect reports coming to you. Then I've very little doubt that it would also be the case that the emperor would respect a report from you. He would also, of course, be expecting a report from your independent financial official, the procurator. So always nice, to have two lines of information from somewhere, just so that you can check that these guys are not up to anything which is not to your advantage. And in the same way, I think, that in a provincial capital, there would be a repository of information about the province in general, so that when you arrived, there would be people there who'd been there before you, but you could actually sort of just look up what was going on at that point in time. Now, the problem, of course, is none of this would have been of any interest whatsoever to people who wrote ancient literature. So, I think we're in that very awkward position where we are arguing from silence, but it's an almost inevitable silence. Now, there is a little bit, we can say, can't we, from Tacitus' Annals. So very famously, when Tiberius becomes emperor, he has read out in the Senate a document which lists all the armies, all the sorts of texts, and there's also state of the nation type thing. And then very famously that bit at the end saying, and Augustus then added, he thought the empire shouldn't get any bigger. Again, people sometimes forget, but you can put to that beginning of Annals 4, where again Tacitus sort of lists where legions are at every point around the empire. Now, this is a man, as far as we know, who didn't serve on the frontier. He's talking about a period before he's active, before he's born, in fact, he must have dug that out of senatorial records and such like. So I think there are, strong reasons to suppose that there is a repository of information, that this information is going up. Some of it, of course, will be lost in transmission. You might not want, as commander on an auxiliary base, to draw to someone's attention that something very embarrassing has happened recently and such like, because it's not to your advantage to do that, or to big up stuff that you've done. That's also potentially possible. So we've got to be aware of errors. But I think the idea that everybody just comes in here. And going back to what we said about Vietnam, so you're there for the first time and it's all new to learn, is probably not going to be right. The problem is we just don't have the backup stuff, but then the sort of stuff we've got from the ancient world is not the sort of, is not the sort of material that would interest itself in these sort of very, very pragmatic things.
You mentioning a change of emperor made me think there was a change of personnel all the way back from the Republican period across government or across administration. So there's got to be some kind of institutional apparatus of sorts. Surely that's kind of...
Yeah, and, sometimes those changes, again, this is where perhaps the idea of a deep state is an interesting one. Do politicians matter at the end of the day? Or are they just froth on the top of the pier? The Emperor Trajan notoriously said Domitian was a bad man, but he had good friends. And some of those friends pop up under his own administration. In other words, there is a level of bureaucratic continuity underneath what is certainly presented as, although probably is not, a major policy rupture. Trajan would want to say that his rule was completely different to the rule of the Emperor Domitian. Now, whether when one looks at it that's true is a very, very moot point. So again, I think, presentation of what one's doing and what one's actually doing is sort of important in that regard. And yeah, I think, again, the army, the fact that you do have, it's very hard to know how to characterise the centuriate. It's not really non-commissioned. At the same time, it's not quite commissioned in our sense of that word, but there is a sort of backbone of continuity there. That at one level preserves pragmatic knowledge, and my guess would be that in the Principia of any Roman fortress there would be information upon the locality, and that could be drawn upon by people coming to there for the first time to sort of ground themselves in what they were doing. I could be wrong in saying that, but it would seem to me crazy were that sort of background stuff not available.
Well, this draws me to the idea of strategy or potentially grand strategy. But the idea, once we can accept that the probability that there is some kind of institutional knowledge or some form of a maybe shallow state or a deep state or some kind of, like you say, to what degree do the individuals at the top matter, and to what degree is there this kind of behemoth of an institution ploughing forward? If there is some kind of state behind the state, that would allow for some kind of grand strategy in a way that maybe the kind of 1-2-dimensional picture of new emperor, new stuff, the emperor's doing everything kind of picture would allow for. Do you buy into the idea that there might be some kind of grand strategy in what the Romans are doing?
I think at one level, yes. I think we also need to remember that emperors could have a sharp personal impact on policy in a way that maybe politicians nowadays don't have the ability to do. Our monarchy, for example, I suppose since George V really has been completely emasculated. But prior to that, monarchs did make decisions which mattered in British politics. And, we now live in a world where we would regard it as absolutely crazy for the monarch to make a policy decision. But that's us being conditioned by our own times. And he said, let's be honest, most of us are not, I'd include myself in this, are not very imaginative people, and they find it hard to imagine a world which doesn't operate at some level like our own times.
Maybe more like a US president?
I think there is much more of as a presidential feel to Roman emperors, yes. I mean, they do matter in that sense. And actually here, I think, again, we've got something which is quite interesting, is that potentially, I think, we've got more chance of there being a grand strategy as such in the imperial period, where continuity matters. And in the Republican period, you were around at the top of the tree for a year. You want to make some money out of that. You want to make a name for yourself. But after that, it really doesn't matter for you anymore. In fact, perhaps leaving a mess behind because then somebody else has to clear up the mess, possibly is quite a smart political move. Yep. But if you're an emperor, presumably your ambition is to die in your bed. Now, a nice comfy bed at that. And that means you've got to think more long-term, perhaps, than people had done in the Republic.
Maybe somewhat familiar. But, I mean, in some ways, even in the modern period where the same incentives exist to leave that kind of mess, we have kind of two layers, I guess, working most of the time. There is some kind of overarching grand strategy when we look at modern history, but then there is also the kind of localized mess that maybe one person makes towards the end of their administration compared to another. So maybe even going back into the Republican period, there might have been some kind of, I mean, it's quite clear with Carthage, there seems to be some kind of overall goal towards, I mean, there's obviously this argument about whether they are falling into empire at this point or whether they're actually aiming for empire, but there does seem to be a kind of broadening of the Roman horizons in this period.
Yeah, no, I think Carthage presents, as Rome sees it anyway, possibly rightly, possibly wrongly, an existential threat. Yeah? If there's going to be a big Carthage, there isn't room for a big Rome. And so there's going to be trouble. I suppose an interesting choice there, coming back to places like Spain, for example, is Rome could have pulled away from Spain at the end of the Second Punic War. She chose not to do so. And in that respect, I suppose, the defeat of Carthage is where Rome acquires an empire outside of Italy in some ways. And she doesn't look back at that point. And running through, I think, the Roman mindset is the notion that we do have the right to rule the world. And this is good and it is proper. I mean, he's written, of course, in Virgil, the court poet of the Emperor Augustus, very firmly, as Jupiter say, I give these people empire without end. And I think, that's the hymn sheet that the Romans sing to at the end of the day. It gets increasingly more difficult for them to do that. And I think perhaps they begin to think more carefully about what they need to do to hang on to what they've got. But the idea of getting a little bit extra, if we can, is always around.
Before we kind of dive into the idea of strategy or grand strategy, how would you best define grand strategy in this kind of period, or in general?
Well, I suppose a grand strategy is something that we say, what are, in modern cant terms, what is your vision? This is the ghastly terms, aren't they? But never mind. If we've got to behave like we're in primary school nowadays, okay. Is it we want to rule the world? Then underneath that, there's how do we get to ruling the world? Or is it actually the bit of the world we've got is sort of okay? How do we keep hold of this bit of the world and stop other people grabbing it off us? And I think there is a debate in the Roman world between those two things. I think the first one, we should rule the world, is always there. It's just that as that gets harder and harder, it's more difficult to hang on to that. And over time, almost, if you like, a series of face-saving excuses pop up to try and persuade not only another audience, but I think an internal audience, the people who are vocalising these things themselves, that they've got the best of the world. There's nothing else out there worth taking. So in fact, we've achieved the strategy of ruling the world, the bit that's any good, and then the rest is just rubbish, and who cares about that anyway?
So there is some kind of implicit nod to a grand strategy, at least in the justifications for not doing it. There is in some ways they're implicitly accepting that they want to do it. How can we tell when we're looking at strategy in the Roman period? Because from the movement of legionaries and armies, we can see tactics, lots of tactics. How can we tell when we're looking at something that's strategy, something that's kind of broader?
I think you could say, I mean, and you know, this comes back to works like the work of Edward Luttwak, for example. Where do the Romans go and what are they aiming at? So are the Roman incursions into Germany, for example, just simply we want to go forwards? Or are they looking at thinking about the River Elbe and how the River Elbe forms a much nicer line with the River Danube than the Rhine does, so that we can iron out what I suppose would be called a re-entrant in modern strategic terms, the so-called agri decumate, so this isosceles triangle pointing into the line of the Roman Empire. And obviously, if you only gain, in terms of length, the small side of the isosceles triangle, but actually have to man the two long sides of the isosceles triangle, this makes no sense at all. So trying to fill those things in potentially makes a lot of sense in that regard. Now, that in turn, of course, and there's again an enormous debate about this, if you're going to do that sort of thing, you need to know about geography. A small example from around here, the Manchester area, if you want to think about where the Romans put their base at Chester. So Chester is, and you know, one of the reasons it's remained an important town throughout history, is in a very strategic place, isn't it? It commands the North Welsh coast. It commands the passage up into Lancashire. It loops back onto the Cheshire Plain, probably the richest agricultural land in the northwest. So by dropping your base there, you can get 3 lots of work out of it. You could have dropped a legionary base at Rill, but this wouldn't have been any good for the other 2 factors. Anyway, we could go on in the same sort of way. So are those things accidents, or are those things part of strategy? And one of the things that's interesting is that when one looks at the positioning of Roman fortifications, particularly large ones, they do seem to bear these sort of advantageous pieces of positioning. Now, again, I think, you know, that there's another way one could look at this, which would be to say that Roman mapping at a local level is really very good. I don't know if you're familiar, I hope you're not actually, with the Corpus Agrimensorum, this sort of set of manuals. It's one of the few sets of practical manuals we've got from antiquity about land measuring and how to survey things and such like.
As it turns out, not, no.
And the Romans are clearly red hot on this. They know how to do this for a town. They know how to mark out individual plots of land and such like. They have a primitive theodolite they can do this stuff with. So in that respect, local mapping is good. I don't think we can really argue about that. Of course, whether that can then be translated into mapping on a larger scale is an interesting question. Now, a lot of scholars would say, no, it can't be, and therefore the idea of thinking about so-called scientific or economic frontiers, strategic positioning, simply won't work, because there just isn't the knowledge to do that. And that's been one of course, the big criticisms of people like Luttwak, saying it's all very well for you sitting in the Pentagon with spy satellites, modern atlases and such like. You can see all of this stuff. The Romans didn't have that. So actually, you're trying to drop on them sorts of stuff they couldn't do, and indeed, possibly, arguably, wouldn't even have thought of doing because the possibility didn't exist.
Has any statistical analysis been done on all the Roman bases that existed, and to what degree there's a kind of statistical likelihood that they're actually choosing these places carefully? And if there is evidence to show that they are disproportionately in fantastic locations, are they built on top of other locations which were there because they were such good locations, and over time the kind of evolutionary pressure on those locations was such that, in the same way that the modern Chester is still there because it was such a good location, and if it was in a bad location we wouldn't have modern whatever it is city. So is there an argument that it's sort of they've used other people's or generations worth of kind of knowledge and built on top of something else that was there?
Sometimes I think that the answer to that question is yes, and as you rightly say, that's almost inevitable in some cases. I mean, but again, when one looks at, say, transport infrastructure, it's often not surprising that the road, the railway and the canal go in the same place, because this is the obvious place to put something. It's the most economic place, and so on and so forth. I think, what Luttwak would say as a pushback is that what he's done is described a phenomenon that he sees in the Roman world and has produced an explanation for that phenomenon. And therefore it is for other people to say, you can have, I don't know how many coincidences you can have, but, it's an interesting question, isn't it? So I think Roman geography is very, very important in that respect. And, there are curiosities there. So Ptolemy's map, so to speak, now, whether Ptolemy ever's, what we have from Ptolemy are data points, which then people can join up and make a map. Whether it was intended to look like that is an interesting question. By and large, it's not perfect by any means, but nonetheless, the Europe that comes out of it, apart from the top of Scotland, which seems to have gone wrong by about 90 degrees, but the rest of it is recognisable, and arguably is recognisable to the degree that one could formulate a grand strategy off it. So I think, again, it's a lot of these things are about choices you make about other things as to whether this info would have been available for the Romans. If you feel it was available for the Romans, it's then quite hard to resist the idea that they would have applied it in a fairly sensible way, in the way that, throughout history, people have applied these things to military thinking.
What's your hunch as a general, having looked at all the arguments back and forth?
I suspect I'm an outlier in that I do feel that Luttwak and more recently a guy called James Lacey have got a point. Whether that point can be pushed as far as they want it to be pushed, I think is, again, difficult. But nonetheless, I think we are in danger sometimes of throwing out the baby with the bathwater by sort of saying, well, the Romans have this really expensive Roman army is more than half, probably more than 3/4 of the Roman state, and it sort of hangs around here for 100 years, and yet the Romans don't really know what they're doing with it. I mean, that to me is an awkwardness in saying that these things are just accidental.
Yeah, I mean, my instinct in general is I think that people consistently seem to underestimate the ancient world in the same way that maybe Moses Finley and that sort of period of historians tended to underestimate the sophistication of the ancient world. I'm wondering, if we think of strategy, they could be trying to optimize expansion. They could be trying to optimize for the prevention of an invasion. They could be trying to manage raids or extract revenue. The revenue could be one of the big drivers of where the Romans are going. Keeping the army loyal, There's many different options that could drive what strategy is behind their movement. Now, obviously, from the sounds of it, Luttwak's thinking is about preventing invasion. Solid, good, natural, defensible positions that are as short as possible. So there's a combination of defensible and economics involved. To your mind, of all these kind of various options, what's the hierarchy of importance to a Roman strategy planner if he's sat in front of his large map and he's looking at the various options for his armies, or there's an emperor having a meeting? What's at the top of his mind? In what order is he worried about? Is he more worried about expansion, preventing invasions, managing raids, revenue? What's the driver here?
I think at one base level, the driver is always, especially if you're an emperor. And here, again, there's another dynamic that's perhaps worth thinking about. If you're an emperor, expanding the empire will play well. Yep. And Brian Campbell, very interestingly, in his work on the Roman armies, pointed out, I think quite rightly, that emperors who come with a weak claim to the purple or without a decent military CV are the most aggressive. Whereas emperors who come with a portfolio behind them often don't need to do don't need to attack in quite the same sort of way. On the other hand, I think also dealing with threats, and again in the north and the west, those threats perhaps are harder to manage in some ways. Not least, I think, because the sorts of societies on the other side of the fence are what I suppose one might broadly characterise as heroic societies. So you get to be top bloke by showing that you're the great soldier. The way you do this is, of course, by hammering your neighbour and stealing his stuff. And the bigger the neighbour and the more attractive the stuff, the better it will redound to your credit. So, if you've got a choice and if you think you're up for it, nicking somebody's pigs from next door or going into the Roman Empire and stealing some really nice things, you're going to go and steal something from the Roman Empire. You can then present yourself to your own people as a great hero who can take on this enormous institution and win, and so on and so forth. So I think Roman frontiers are always proactive. That's why you have these outposted forts, that there is an information system out there, and at the same time I think there is quiet diplomacy going on to try and win these chiefs over. Now, it's not as easy, I think, for the Romans to buy these guys in as it is to buy in the urbanised aristocracies of the empire. Effectively, what you're saying to them is, look, as long as you run this thing in a decent way, we can guarantee stability. You won't be knocked off your perch by the hoi polloi locally, and we can guarantee that your descendants will be at the top of the tree as well. The nearest, I guess, you can do for this, and again, I think Thompson's work on the early Germans is good on this, is for the Romans to turn around to these people and say, first of all, we will give you gifts. Yeah, that looks great at one level in that local society, but if one reads early medieval material, of course, the giving of a gift to someone also sort of makes you their man. So if you're Beowulf is a good example, isn't it? So, there's Beowulf, he sits in his hall and he gives out rings. And the expectation then is that those people will fight with Beowulf. Of course, it can go wrong. When the dragon rocks up, everybody runs away. And the one guy who remains, a bloke called Wiglaf, has a real go at the people who run away and say, you ingrates, this guy gave you all this stuff, you're meant now to fulfil your side of the bargain, and you don't. But arguably, you might say, there is moral pressure there. So this is bribery in the sense sometimes as naked cowardice, and of course that can go very badly wrong from the Roman side. Severus Alexander is lynched in Germany in the 3rd century by his own troops when he tries to buy off the Germans because he's just seen as a coward. So one has to be careful about this sort of diplomacy, and I think that's true, all the way through to the present day, isn't it? Sometimes you have to deal with people you dislike and in ways that you're not particularly comfortable with, but it sort of works out. On the other hand, you can turn round, I think, if you're a Roman, to some of these people, and after all, these heroic societies, as I know all too well myself, as age catches up with you, you're not as tough, you're not as fit as you used to be, and there will be another generation of people who want to be the tribal chieftain. The Romans, if you become their friend, will manage things, or they'll say to you, we'll manage things to make sure that you'll be okay, that your son will be okay, and therefore, if you like, the hand of patronage, never, of course, presented in those terms, because these people have to turn round to their own people and present themselves as the big man, the friend, an equal of these other people. But nonetheless, you can see how that sort of thing would work. Equally, I think, if we look at Roman fortifications, certainly in this earlier period, well until, say, probably the 4th century, they are not designed as defensive points. They are designed as places from which you sally forth to go and fight the enemy on their land rather than waiting for them to come into your land. So in that regard, these frontiers, I think, for a very long time, as long as the Romans can manage, are proactive, and the idea is you will spot the threat, You will either hopefully deal with it in a diplomatic fashion, and again, the Emperor Tiberius, to spill back a little bit in history, seems to have much more success in Germany by simply setting the Germans at each other's throats than sending legions out to fight them in forests. But if that goes wrong and you have to fight, you want to go and fight there, not wait for them to come into your territory, which again, of course, has, I think, all sorts of political problems. If people are regularly raiding the Roman Empire, why would you want to be part of the Roman Empire? It's a modern situation, isn't it? So we pay taxes to the government. If all of a sudden we are plagued by crime on a regular basis, people would then say, well, why are we paying our taxes? Why do we have allegiance to this institution? It's not giving us anything back for what we've put in. In the same way, I think, in the Roman world, the psychological damage from having endless raids and incursions into Roman territory is going to damage the reputation of the institution, and therefore it's much better to have a proactive response and to take the fight out to the enemy rather than wait for them to come and get you.
Well, surely there is, to some degree, there's variations to how bad these things can get.
Yeah. Even
if you are being raided every so often, you might still be relatively well protected in comparison to what's going on the other side of the border. But a good comparison that strikes me to some degree is the Vikings with Paris, where it ends up backfiring, where Paris just keeps paying out money to these people not to attack them, and then eventually it just becomes a racket where they realised, well, the more we attack them, the more money we get paid. And to some degree, there's always that risk too, where if you're paying money to a local tribe not to raid you, well, then they have every incentive to make you really, really worried so that they can extract more money out of you. So there seems to be a kind of incentives balance. And also because their world is quite messy, I suspect, where there's the ups and downs of these tribes maybe, again, projecting because I've no real idea how these tribes worked, but if they were a messier society where things, then you could end up paying someone on the wrong side of an internal squabble. So it seems to me that this German active border, like you say, seems to be quite a inefficient system. And is that anything that maybe looked back or others look at, where the Roman, because this is very costly, both in men and material. This is not an efficient way of doing business. Is that something that the Romans would have considered in the way that they were trying to position themselves?
Yeah, no. At one level, I think it's fair to say that. I mean, it's also I can't remember the name of the bloke. It's a book that came out just after Fukuyama's end of history. There was a book, wasn't there, which said, that there will always be rough edges in cultural clashes. Huntington, there was the name, it was Samuel Huntington, wasn't it? It caused a great stir at the time, and I just realised very wicked, because it came out, of course, in the context of a world where we think there is always a solution. And Huntington was saying, well, actually, sometimes there just aren't solutions. You've got to manage problems. So the idea, I think, that you are ever going to have a smooth edge to the Roman Empire is just not true. What you can do to some degree is make it worthwhile of people on the other side to be on your side. So, you can do your fighting against other people. And as I think you rightly say, the history of the Barbarian is messy. And again, I shouldn't be apologetic about this. I mean, we just don't know how those things happen. We are literally dealing with prehistoric societies. Tragically, some information was out there. Tacitus tells us that Arminius, the great German chieftain, was sung about amongst German tribes. But of course, as time goes by, your heroes change, and what we've got is a whole new set of heroes from the later period that have been preserved for us, and none of the lays about Arminius have survived at all. So we are sort of stuck in that regard. Of course, another thing, and again, Ludwig has interesting ideas about this. I'm not sure these ones work as well as some of the other ones, about so-called client kingdoms. So what you do is effectively groom a group of people on the edge of your empire, the ruling class in particular, see which way their bread is buttered. They become very Roman in their ways, and that over time that radiates out into the rest of their society, and it is slowly absorbed. Our own island has an example of that, and of course it has an example with Boadicea of it going catastrophically wrong in the other way. Curious thing, of course, about that uprising is that it's led by some of the most Romanised of the Britons on this island. Boadicea came from a background which was very Philo-Roman, as far as we know, but it was very, very badly mishandled. On the other hand, further south, King Cogidubnus, we don't know when his kingdom ended because it simply seamlessly blended then into the province of Britannia. So trying to do that, I think Ludwig wants to see this as almost a strategy in itself, that you garner in these people and that there's an expectation that they will simply be absorbed into the empire later on. Now, whether that's because that is a plan, or whether it happens again through simple exigencies. In Judea, of course, the later Herodians are making such a mess of things, and they're awfully near the other superpower of the day, Parthia. You don't want instability there, that Rome feels that she has to act at that point. I suspect with Boadicea, had Boadicea had sons, not daughters, there may well not have been a problem. As far as Rome was concerned, Rome had already had a problem a little bit further north with Queen Cartimandua. The Romans were never comfortable with female rulers, and they probably again just thought to themselves, we're inviting instability here in an area as we're pushing north in Britain that we cannot afford to have instability. We need to close this thing down. And I think there it's just done very, very badly. But you can sort of see the specific circumstances as to why Rome there is not acting through a general policy idea, but is actually acting in response, not very well, but nonetheless understandable response to a set of circumstances she finds rather threatening.
Yeah, and maybe it looked like it's always pushing his points a little bit further than maybe the evidence suggests. But it could be a halfway point where it's, if you want to calm your border area and you have a client king that you're kind of grooming, that automatically over generations can lead to the same end result without it necessarily being a direct strategy. And maybe, would it make sense to you that different parts of the empire are doing things very differently? Or is it more like the forts, where even a fort in the northern foggy bits of Britain is very similar? Is that instructive? That the fact that we have completely different parts of the empire with completely different problems, and we have very similar physical constructions, do you reckon that carried over to the way that they perceived tactics and strategy as well?
I think that there's likely to be a Roman way of doing things. I mean, again, our own empire in the 19th century, I think, shows this. That, the British Army, you can download them from archive.org, can't you? The field books of the day that tell you how you should do these things. Now, how you do those things in West Africa, how you do those things on the northeast or northwest frontiers of India, in central India, are going to be rather different. And there, again, I think, you're going to have a mixture, aren't you? You're going to have very, very sort of tiresome, hidebound people who say, it says this the way in the book, so we do it this way. And there are going to be people who say, well, it says that in the book, but manifestly, here we need to do things a little bit differently. And again, if one looks at little bits of Roman kit and such like, you can see that Roman uniforms and such like change to fit the circumstances to a degree. That's not to say, I think, that there aren't sort of standard things that are going on. But just as we presided over, reasonably successfully in my opinion, a very sprawling, multicultural sort of empire, but it all pretty much hung together. I think the Roman world is very similar in that respect, so that there are going to be striking differences, but there are also going to be commonalities so that we can say this is all of a piece, so to speak.
So you'd recognise you're in Roman territory. It doesn't really matter where you were. There was a Roman, like you say, a Roman way of doing things. How much frontier policy came from the centre? Because you just spoke about the idea of local, maybe soldiers or commanders doing things in their own way. How much of what was going on was local to the area, to the specific guy who was in charge of said job, and how much of it was directed from the centre? This is how I want you to do things. This is what we want it to look like. These are the people. And I guess this also ties into what we were talking before about the flow of information. How much information was flowing up and down the chain here?
Well, I think some very, very big decisions have to come from the centre. So when the Romans decide that they want to go back into the lowlands of Scotland, only just not in fact completing Hadrian's Wall. It is one of the striking things about Hadrian's Wall that within 20 years of this enormous project, it's virtually abandoned. That's got to be the emperor. Yeah. All emperors give instructions to their governors, things called mandata, which their governors are expected to obey. Unfortunately, we have no set of those things. We have hints about what they are, so they're embodied in the digest of Roman law, and the top one seems to be actually anything for a quiet life. So, in other words, as long as there aren't any rebellions, the required tribute is coming in. There is no instability in your province. I think many people are just left to get on with it. Now, for all we know, there may be a broad set of instructions underneath there. And again, of course, another thing here is we are hostage of individuals, aren't we? So we've got the younger Pliny. So we got the younger Pliny's correspondence with the Emperor Trajan. It's interesting in a way because, of course, Pliny's dead when this book is published. His other stuff, he's had a hand in presenting himself, whereas this one is being presented in this posthumous way, so he can't tart it up to make it fit his thing. And he does come over as what one would call once upon a time anyway as an old woman. Yep. So can I get out of bed at 9 o'clock rather than at 8:30? This and I think the Emperor Trajan's face must have been a picture when somebody came into the Palatine and said the post from Bithynia's here, sire. Oh, for God's sake, what's he on about this time? And in fact, I think in some of the letters you can see the emperor slowly losing his temper with the governor.
Exasperation.
For heaven's sake, make a decision, mate. That's what I sent you there for. But you might say that shows that, unless it's just Pliny's character, my guess is it is just Pliny's character. But does this show that, there was actually a frightening degree of micromanagement? And you can sort of understand it from Pliny's point of view. After all, if you make the wrong move, you can wind up dead. Consequently, is it best not to make any move at all? In the same way, going back to what we were saying about Roman strategic decisions and such like, possibly the most life-threatening thing you can do as a Roman imperial general is to have a successful campaign. No? Because then you're starting to intrude on the emperor's domain as being top general. Consequently, doing nothing or doing as little as possible might be something that's in the back of your mind. Now, the other thing, of course, that's in the back of your mind is that all Romans know that being a great general is the best thing you can ever be. So there's a sort of tension there between those who are very ambitious and those who are a little bit worried. And again, perhaps on this island we're lucky in having the Tacitus Agricola, where arguably we see those two tensions coming together. So Tacitus, very clear, isn't he, that Agricola is done down by a useless, incompetent and jealous emperor who can't, do a military campaign in the wonderful way that Agricola's done it? 'Or do we have Agricola, a man who's been born in the wrong period, a man who's been born in the wrong place, a man who, has no desire to do anything, and 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 who, has no desire to do any the gung-ho man who is, he's desperately running out of control. Domitian is there tearing his hair out, or what little hair he's got, because of course he goes bald over time. Perhaps Agricola is one of the reasons, who knows? Sort of saying, how can I stop this guy? Because stopping someone who is doing something which the population, will regard as a tremendous thing, expanding the Imperium Romanum, is not so easy. And arguably, we know that Domitian's favourite bedtime reading were the memoirs of the Emperor Tiberius, sadly lost to us. But maybe Domitian was sitting there thinking, this is what Tiberius did with Germanicus, isn't it? He waits for a moment where there's a sort of climactic thing, praises the guy to the sky and pulls him out of there because he's just causing endless trouble for no good reason. So again, I think, one of the things that's important here is if you invest as emperor in being top general, and after all, that's what emperor means, where does that leave people underneath? And what does it do to their thought processes when they think about, am I outshining my boss? And what could happen to me as a consequence?
Have you ever thought about to what degree this kind of thinking explains what we actually end up seeing on the ground? This kind of tension between taking no action at all and therefore maybe things that seem less than optimal keep going, like the German border, and maybe things that shouldn't have happened end up happening, like the whole kick-off in Britain, where we don't have really any good idea whether this was him causing the trouble and being gung-ho, or if he's reacting to a situation which has been badly managed by someone else.
It perhaps explains why we don't hear about many Roman generals, so to speak. So again, perhaps that's points to a problem with Roman imperial history in general, and that after Tacitus peters out, we only have for the so-called high point of the Roman Empire, the second century, essentially, I suppose. We don't even have most of Cassius Dio. We have excerpts of Dio. So there's an information gap which can be filled in epigraphically from time to time, and we do find more Roman heroes emerging on stone than we do on paper. But nonetheless, I think there must be a notion that doing stuff off your own bat is not something you can do. And notoriously, the Emperor Corbulo, when he's recalled from campaigning across the German frontier, sort of wistfully says, previous Roman generals lived in better times and what have you. Because clearly he was a man who too wanted to fight, was reeled in by Claudius, dies under Nero, perhaps because Nero thought he was involved in a conspiracy towards the end of Nero's reign, and that he was worried about the pull he had on the army. So again, the idea of military success being dangerous to the person who's had that success, I think, is out there. And of course, the emperor can only be in one place at a time. So again, the great campaigns of the imperial period often are headed up by the emperor. Claudius doesn't do the fighting in Britain, but he makes sure that he's the guy who goes into Colchester at the end of the initial invasion, and I think that's very important for him to do that. Given again that the man physically is a cripple of some sort, that he's not prepossessing in that sense, and Romans would have noticed that more than we would. I think that's going to be important in that regard. He has no military CV, so allowing another general to conquer this place beyond the ocean stream and being seen to be the man who went in and did it is far too dangerous. Trajan, of course, heads up his campaigns in Dacia. He heads up his campaign into Mesopotamia. Septimius Severus campaigns personally in Scotland. He brings his sons to campaign with him in Scotland, which I think is a crucial part of what he's doing there. So the only guy who doesn't do this to some degree is Antoninus Pius in Britain, who sends a chap called Lollius Urbicus over to do that. Now, Lollius Urbicus is a Berber. By this time, maybe that didn't matter so much, but I suspect he's still a general who is déclassé enough not to be a potential threat to the emperor. And that might too matter.
So the perception of the Romans is very much a physical, of fighting, is a physical perception of fighting. You have to be out there, you have to be holding your sword, and you're doing stuff. Being a strategist or a commander or leading a force in the way that maybe happened in the 20th century, where we have these kind of famous generals like General Patton, etc., who they're not out there with guns, but they were still very highly respected and seen as these kind of mini heroes because of what they were able to command. That doesn't seem to exist.
I think that, again, as so often, there's a tension in this. So if you were to look at, say, Onosander's work on strategy, which, you know, is meant to be dedicated to a general in the field, Quintus Verenius, Onosander says, you know, you shouldn't lead from the front. That's actually selfish. Your job is to win a battle, not win glory for yourself. But I think, you know, that's a hard lesson for many Romans. Agricola, again, you know, what we're told as he marches into Wales, that he goes ante-agmen, in front of the column, in the good heroic way. So although there is, I think, a realisation that you know, the role of a general is not to lead from the front, the culture of Rome very much says you should lead from the front. And maybe there, once again, we see the ghost of the Iliad, something everybody will have read, of course, at this time. It is the text every educated person has read, is still affecting the mindset of these people. Dr. Johnson once said, didn't he, every man feels less of himself for not being a soldier. I think that emotion, which I think Johnson is right about, frankly, but is even stronger in antiquity than it is today.
Okay. And maybe the ghost of Alexander too.
Oh, I think so, yes. And certainly there are quite a few emperors, the Emperor Trajan is one of them, who start to get a sort of Alexander derangement as time goes by. He is the guy to beat. There's no two ways about that. And yeah, so he too, I think, is stalking the mindset of people an awful lot.
Going all the way back to Caesar, quite famously.
Oh, yes, and Scipio Africanus. I mean, some of the things said about Scipio's early life clearly have been invented so that he can become the Roman Alexander. I mean, I think that's indisputable, really.
So if we try and bridge the kind of ground strategy with battlefield tactics, what binds those two together is the flow of information. Obviously, to make ground strategy, you need good information. And battlefield tactics, in many ways, is about the flow of information. So some of the great strategists and the great generals, what we see is basically them having an information lead on their opponent.
Yeah.
So to what degree is spying or general intelligence gathering really very underestimated, very underspoken about, maybe in the conversations of these great battles, but really kind of fundamentally underlies everything that's going on?
No, I think again, you know, when we see the battle, we are seeing the tip of an iceberg, aren't we? And in there, scouting in all Roman strategic manuals stress very, very strongly the need to scout, the need to know what's in front of you, the need to know what's also on the sides of you. So in that respect, when Varus marches into Germany, thinking he's in friendly territory, to be fair to the man, he had no reason to doubt Arminius. I think you or I would have made the same mistakes in some ways, although I'd like to hope that we wouldn't have thrown away the rule book quite to the degree that he did. Yeah, but nonetheless, you can see why that was happening. But beyond that, I think there is always a stress on information, as you rightly say, knowing where your enemy are, making sure that they can't get round the side of you. In the same way, Roman battlefields, what you want to do is to secure your flanks. Again, hopefully by aggressive marching, you will force the enemy to fight on terrain of your own choosing. Quite interesting, again, when we look at some of the texts we got from our own island. This is how Suetonius Paulinus is presented in the cumulative battle in Boadicea's uprising. That he is the man in control. He chooses the field of battle. He chooses to turn, and foolishly the Brits take the bait, and we have a description which is effectively a set-piece Roman battle. Curiously, of course, the rival account, much later, written by Cassius Dio, has Suetonius outmanoeuvred, outflanked, and the battle, far from being a set piece, is, as the Duke of Wellington would have said, a damn close run thing, which the Romans come out of with success. As we all know, Dio can't change the end of the story after all, but he's suggesting that the story is a much more tortuous one.
Which one do you buy more?
I don't know, is the honest answer. The Tacitus story is almost too good to be true, but then if one looks, for example, at the Battle of Omdurman in the Sudan, that's also almost too good to be true, so these things can happen. Dio, I'd sort of like to believe more, but there are lots of other problems with Dio's narrative. He clearly doesn't really understand the topography of Britain at all. There's an awful lot of rhetoric in it. That said, there's an awful lot of rhetoric, of course, in Tacitus's account as well. But it's something, I don't have many sleepless nights about ancient history, but this is one that actually I am quite interested in. I really can't make up my mind. I think both are, at one level, plausible. Tacitus he clearly likes his father-in-law. His father-in-law clearly liked Suetonius Paulinus. So one can see the temptation there of setting up a Roman set piece. On the other hand, with Dio, we get a much darker view. Paulinus comes over as a much more incompetent person. But are some of the other mistakes, like not really understanding what Anglesey is and getting it possibly mixed up with Ireland and things like this, is there enough mess there, so to speak, just to dismiss this and say this is just a rhetorical construct, mainly about doing down Nero? I think actually the Tacitus account is mainly about doing down Nero as well, but just doing it in a different sort of way.
What is there any archaeology that points in either direction, or?
No, there's no archaeology at all. I mean, one of the things I actually don't have sleepless nights about is the so-called Battle of Watling Street, which to me is an utter nonsense. Boadicea's last stand, probably somewhere in central southern England, maybe in the Cotswolds, but certainly not on Watling Street.
Right. Would every army have had its own kind of intelligence corps, or is that something that would have had both a centralized and a decentralized aspect to it?
There are groups of people called explorers, exploratores, and I think it's hard to know how many of these there are certainly units of such people. I mean, one of the outpost forts on Hadrian's Wall was called the Camp of the Exploratores. So, I mean, they're clearly doing their stuff there. In terms of other ones, I think it would be surprising, I think, if legions didn't have intelligence attached to them. But by its very nature, these are things people don't talk about a very great deal. So those feedback loops, I think, are there. They can go very badly wrong. Obviously, sometimes Varus, I think, is probably the most obvious example. People foolishly choose to disregard that because they know better, and it just goes horribly and hideously wrong. But by and large, I think that's true. Again, I think, when we look at the north and west of the Roman Empire, very often not all the tribes are marching in lockstep. So finding out information from people who are if not pro-Roman, at least as hostile to other people on the other side of the frontier as they are to the Romans.
Or pro-denaries, pro-money, they might be paying them.
Absolutely, yeah. All of that, I think, is out there as well. So one of the big mistakes, I think, is very hard because we just don't have, or wish we did, the history of the Barbaricum, but it's not to see this world as Romans and barbarians as two monolithic blocks. Neither of them are monolithic, but the barbarian one, I think, is harder sometimes to conceptualise, and simply to remember that for many of those people, their traditional enemies are going to be infinitely more important than the Romans. We talk about peripheries, but everyone's central to themselves, aren't they?
Are the Greeks a good analogy, where you've got the Persians, who are the big behemoth, which in some ways can unite, all the various tribes, but then most of the time the Greeks are fighting other Greeks. Is that a fair?
Yeah, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. Yes, I mean the notion of Medizing. So if you Medize, does it mean you just want to be part of the Persian Empire, or do you find the Persians really handy people to go and bash the people you've been hating for hundreds of years, and then maybe they'll go away and we'll be top in this neck of the woods. So I think Rome is helped a lot in her incursions in places by the fact that there isn't that sort of unity. As time goes by, I think on the other side of the frontier we see a deeper coalescing of groups. So both in Britain and on the continent, larger confederacies seem to emerge. Now again, epigraphically, quite a lot of the old tribal names are still there, but they seem to be there in a more subordinate way, so that we can be part of the Franki, but we can still be part of an earlier tribe as well. But in that regard, I think people simply realise that unless they unite at some level, they're not going to be able to take on the Romans. Or, if you want a darker way of putting it, you could say, but by uniting, we have a greater chance of successfully raiding the Roman Empire, getting the dosh and getting back home again, than we ever would do just doing this as a sort of individual enterprises.
So the Romans become a bigger and bigger kind of shadow over their world, to the point where they're kind of forced into uniting if they have any chance of being able to.
Yeah, the Romans I think, fragmentary units on the other side of the frontier. They're easier to push around. They present less of a threat. Soft power, bribery, diplomacy is always working in that way. People, of course, flee to Rome, so the Romans like to collect kings and kinglets, and then with the hope that they can slot back a complacent ruler here, there, and everywhere. So if you've got that going on one side, you might say in some respects, of course, pushing that too hard is counterproductive, because it will produce a reaction to it, and that reaction will be to say, well, if we don't unite, we're just all lost. And it's where I suppose your dislike of your neighbour is then countervailed upon to your dislike of a more distant and aggressive power.
All quite topical, I guess, with the Shah of Iran, who's in America, sort of waiting to kind of slot back into that.
Well, potentially. I mean, again, of course, client rulers can go wrong, can't they? Just because the Romans have someone they think they can slot into place doesn't mean that were they to be slotted into place, they're going to be successful. Sometimes they're simply not successful, and sometimes they can turn on people. I mean, arguably, the Dacian king Decebalus starts as a Roman client, and then he sees perceived weakness, and he just decides to go his own way, leaving Rome with a problem that they in the end use military force to resolve.
We have this fantastic, should we call that a replica?
Yes, I think we can call it a replica, yes.
This fantastic replica. Do walk me through it. So when we're talking tactics, I think this helps people to really understand what it is that they're facing literally at the sharp end.
Okay, so yeah, this is a replica of a so-called Pompeian Gladius, only called that because the best example was found in Pompeii. As you can see, it's a relatively short weapon. In fact, if you're a sword junkie, you will already say this isn't a sword, it's a short sword, which would in fact be true. It's got parallel sides which come to a point, so it's not a weapon that's primarily designed to slash with. It's designed to thrust with. Earlier Roman swords, the one that this one supersedes, was usually called the Mainz Gladius, has a slightly longer point, slight wasting on the sides of the blade, and that shows that it was used for cutting as well as thrusting. This one is perfectly well balanced. I mean, you could fence with this sword, and it is the sort of sword that gladiators would use. Again, thinking about gladiatorial combat is hard, though, in that regard. But effectively, you would hunker down behind a large rectangular shield, probably in a slightly squatting posture, and then you would thrust out from the line of those shields towards the head, or maybe towards the stomach. You can also, Roman shield, sure you know, has a large metal protuberance in the centre where the handle is. You could use that, and Roman texts are very specific about this, should use that as a weapon in and of itself. So you try and smash that in someone's face, and then at that point stab them in the stomach. And if you were to look at some of the metopes from the Trapezium Traiani, the big monument celebrating the Dacian Wars, to be found at Adam Clissi in Romania, you can actually probably see that move happening, so that the shield has gone up and the sword is then going into the stomach in that regard. What, of course, we're missing here, and maybe one day I will treat myself to a replica of that, is the Roman Pilum, the spear that was carried by legionaries and was a throwing weapon. So effectively, although sadly we have, of course, no formal tactical manuals in this regard, it looks like the Pilum is a charge-breaking weapon. It's a fairly heavy javelin. It's designed in such a way that it will punch through a shield, and then it's got a long, thin metal shank. It will keep going. So the idea is it won't just stick in your shield. It will go through the shield and then stick in you. That's the key to it. But by and large, as far as we can see, what the Roman army would want to do is goad its opponent into charging. At the last moment, and again this is where discipline, of course, plays a very important role, discharge its pillar, breaking that charge into an awful mess, and then would charge into the mess that it had created, probably in wedge-like formations, finishing off what was left there with these swords, where, again, as I say, you're aiming really to thrust, to kill, rather than to cut. And once again, it's a nostalgic work, but Vegetius, writing at the end of the Roman period, of course the ancestors always do things in the right way, but says, our soldiers of old were taught to thrust and not to cut, and indeed looked laughably on people who used to cut. It is said, of course, this is one of the reasons why European fencing is better than fencing in the Far East, that again, thrusting is not something natural to Japanese swordplay. And that means that very, very straightforward tactics are not available to people trained in that tradition. And it's one of the reasons why perhaps European swordplay has an edge in that regard. That was not an intentional joke, by the way. If you see my point, that was.
So just so people can visualise what this would have looked like, they've got the enemy running towards them. This is still in its sheath.
Yeah.
They're holding, ready to throw, and they're kind of daring themselves to wait till the last second.
Yeah. And the nice thing there is, and again, this is why I have a lot of time for reenactors. I know some people get very snooty about this. I think reenactors are a really valuable, practical part of research. That because Roman shields are large, they actually provide quite a good counterweight. So you don't need to run up to throw the pilum. You a couple of steps and then leaning into the shield will provide the leverage that you need to throw the weapon, so it can be thrown at really quite close range. And as I say, it is designed as a penetrative weapon. So if you look at pictures, pictures is perhaps the wrong word. Usually, of course, these things are engraved on stone. You will see at the end of the long thin shank, so a pilum has about 3 foot of narrow iron at the top, then quite often there is a large weight to give it that extra oomph to go through the shield. The metal part is pegged to the wooden haft. Sometimes that breaks. That, of course, is a good thing. It means the weapon cannot be picked up and thrown back. If it lands in a shield, it will break around the shield and make the shield very unwieldy. What doesn't seem to happen is that the metal shaft itself doesn't seem to bend. When reenactors have thrown these things, when they stick in the ground, they don't coil downwards, so to speak. They simply stick there. What can bend off is at the very front end of the pilum, there is a little pyramid type thing, very much like a bodkin from the medieval period. Again, it's a penetrative thing in that respect, but that often bends just directly behind that. That, I suppose, is inevitable from the nature of the weapon. Very much, I think, tactics that were used by ourselves in the Napoleonic Wars. So you would wait for a French column to come very close. You would then deliver a volley into the column, and then you would charge with your bayonets into the bloodied mass that you'd hopefully made the front of the column. And at that point, of course, the issues of morale and such like switch over. People are in a mess. When an ordered body charges into people in a mess, they tend to panic, they tend to run away. So I think it's very much, curiously, although the Romans are very proactive at seeking fields of battle, that their overall strategy is to go out and project power into the Barbaricum. On the field of battle, it's quite often the other way round. Not always. Again, the battle, if Tacitus is right in telling us what happened at Mons Graupius, and after all, his father-in-law was there, there we see the Romans pushing into the mass of Caledonians in quite an active way. But a lot of the other battles do tend to be that little bit more reactive, very much like, I think, as I say, Wellington's approach was to the French in the Napoleonic Wars. And the joy of these things, of course, is you only need one clever trick, don't you? And if the enemy don't have an answer to your clever trick, you don't really need very many more. That said, I think another thing that's important here is the degree of articulation in the Roman army. So you have a command structure which allows people to respond to many commands. Their equipment allows a maximum use of ears and eyes to respond to all sorts of signals, either one's given by the mouth or one's given through horns or waving banners and such like. On the other side, effectively, as far as we can see, there is one tactic, which is charge. That, of course, cuts down the possibilities on the other side. It's also something which would be clearly well known to Roman generals themselves, and they could probably work on that to try to produce an outcome that was satisfactory for themselves, goading the enemy to charge at the wrong time, then knowing that they could respond to that action by something much more than just a counter-charge.
Right, just before we continue, I would like to, mainly because I'm childish, but also maybe for the audience to see, I mean, I don't know if people can tell, there's a weight to this, and obviously some of the longer weapons that they're using, how good is that steel to be able to penetrate fairly thick shields and armor? Because this is something that is like your rifle, something we spoke about before the podcast. This is something that you would really take a lot of care of. Yeah. But that weapon is much more a throwaway weapon. But obviously you need quite a good quality iron on the front of it. Did the Romans have that kind of high quality iron to throw away?
I don't think to throw away, but Roman military units have their own smiths, and that they will be used to making these weapons. Again, one of the reasons you don't find ancient battlefields very often is because obviously metal is valuable, so people would go over and they would pick all of this stuff up. Of course, if the other side win, it's an absolute bonanza day. Large amounts of material gets taken away. There is, it's illegal, in fact, in the Roman Empire to sell weaponry across the frontier. But just like in the American Old West, if the price is right, there are always people who are prepared to do that. So these things drift into the Barbaricum in that way. This weapon in front of us is not really designed to penetrate anything at great depth. And also, again, I think it's worth remembering that a lot of people on the other side would have shields made of wickerwork and such like. Maybe plank boarding would be the best you could manage. So again, the material advantage the Roman army has is really rather high. This weapon, I think, you are not aiming to try and bludgeon your way through armour here. You're aiming to go to an unprotected head, soft parts of the torso and such like. And again, as you can see, really very, very close range.
It really is. And I think this is one of the things that people maybe have the least intuitive conception of, just how... I mean, this is about as long as your arm, or shorter. This is really, I don't know how tall the average Roman was, but this is very close range. You could hear, smell, feel the guy who you were thrusting against right in front of you. And like you say, you're thrusting a slightly upward motion, so you're hunkered down. Yep. It's kind of ballsy stuff, isn't it?
It is. Again, another advantage I think the Romans have is their armies are professional one. So again, Vegetius, as I say, a man as far as we know was never a soldier. He writes this very nostalgic book at the end of the Roman period, but he starts by saying, "Look, how come we've been so successful? We're not bigger than other people. In fact, often we're quite smaller. Physically, we're nowhere near as magnificent specimens." I says it's because we know what we're doing. We train. So it becomes second nature to you. And as he rightly says, no man fears to do what he knows he does well. So if you train day in, day out, and these people would train with these weapons, they would train with overweight wooden weapons, so that when it came to battle, what they were holding was less cumbersome, less weighted than what they were used to, and they would spend ages at a large stick called a palus. It's actually something used in gladiatorial training as well, just practicing their moves on the thing. So when you came to fight, you would be professional, and usually you would win. Now, as we saw in the FA Cup this weekend, it doesn't always work out that way, does it? You wouldn't have expected Mansfield Town to put Crystal Palace to the sword, but they did. But broadly speaking, we know that Macclesfield Town will not win the FA Cup. That in the end, professionalism will out. So I think for the Romans, again, Vegetius is saying is quite right. The two advantages on the field of battle are, one, articulation, that Roman soldiers can respond to various commands and do different things, not just charge. Their kit is better, and they know what they're doing with their kit. And all of that, I think, gives them very, very serious advantages. It's not to say that they won't be called out sometimes, but broadly speaking, the sharp money would be on them.
So in our hypothetical scenario, they've charged, they've had the long spear thrown, and now they're right up and close personal. The barbarians are running. Obviously, in a formation, you can't quite be as fast and as nimble as someone who's on their feet. What happens next? If everyone was just scatters after the first kind of volley is thrown, how does that then play out?
Well, it plays out in terms of how long you want to chase these people and how safe you think chasing those people is. Yeah. So obviously, and again, I think this is one of the problems that the Romans have sometimes on these more northerly frontiers, is that an articulated army, if you smash it to pieces, it's like you and me smashing our watch to pieces. Putting it together isn't too easy. Now, suppose you had a sundial on your wrist. Yep, it's only got 2 bits. If you broke it, you'd have a chance of putting it back together again. So a barbarian horde, if you like, has more chance of recoalescing than a professional army, an articulated army. It can get back together and do its stuff again faster than the professional army. The minus side to that, I suppose, is the heroic side. That certainly on that side, the chiefs will be expected to be in the front line, and that means that they're going to die. Yeah, and that means that then you've got an issue of political leadership. So at that level, there's a problem. But what you want to do, as far as you can, is smash up and scatter your opponent to make that recoalescence that bit harder. Now, on the other hand, what you don't want to do, of course, is snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. The most famous example, of course, on this island is the Battle of Hastings. Yep, so feigned panic is an actual tactic. And, of course, then the psychology works all the other way round. So if you think you've won, you start chasing, you break your formation, and then all of a sudden the other guys wheel round, they're in formation, they're confident because they've paid a trick. You are absolutely shattered by the fact that this has just happened to you, and all of a sudden things go backwards. Again, if you look at Roman writing, there is thought about this. So Marian in his Ectaxis says, hopefully we'll break these guys. When we do, we will send half our cavalry forwards and we will leave the other half back in reserve, so that if something goes wrong and they turn round on us, there will be a solid formation we can fall back on. We won't be caught with our trousers down. In the same way, I think it's fairly clear, my reading anyway, of the Agricola, that at the end of the Battle of Mons Graupius, the Caledonians are trying to draw the Roman army into woodland at the end, and Agricola is smart enough to say, that's enough. We're not going in there. And again, of course, that's where professionalism, discipline also comes into play, stopping people who think they've won, going on, their blood's up, and they're stuff to steal, there are bad guys to kill easily. Stopping them doing all of those things is not so easy. So that's where, again, I think discipline comes into play. It makes it easier for the Romans to stop people. They also know, of course, it will be virtually impossible for their opponents to stop people behaving in this way, and they can plan accordingly.
To what extent do we know that the barbarians were as backwards as we think they were, where they were just, running at the... Was there no tactic?
I think that we certainly know that the Germans like to go in for, again, these wedge-shaped formations. So a thing called the pig's head is something that they indulge in. I think some of their more thoughtful commanders, it tends to be more about sort of rigging up ambushes than doing complex things on the field of battle. I think it's very hard for these people, once they've set their army in motion, to do anything else. You've got to say, well, yeah, that was my plan. Let's now see how it pans out. Yep. That said, and you don't know what's going on here. Certainly in Caesar's Gallic Wars, there is talk from time to time of formations on the Gallic side. Arguably, we know that most of these chiefs had a sort of coterie of professional warriors lurking around them. Now, that, of course, need not mean anything more than that these people are just big and tough, but maybe some of them thought through some of these things a little bit more too. Caesar is, when he talks about these formations, is he either bigging himself up, saying, I thought somebody, they're a bit tougher than you think, these barbarians, or is he actually using the only language he's got to express what's going on there? So he perhaps sees a sort of manoeuvre that he could describe a Roman army doing, uses the terminology for that, but because it's only an approximation, imposing more order onto those people than you might think. Certainly, I think, you can underestimate your opponent. It's a very foolish thing to do. In any form of world, as a military world, political world, or whatever, just because somebody disagrees with you doesn't make them stupid. And unfortunately, many people have that mindset. But I think it is hard to see that there is a complexity of things like this. I mean, that there are primitive things, so you can lure the Romans onto the wrong form of ground. The Goths in the 3rd century managed to make the Romans charge into a bog, for example, things like that. But those are not what you might call tactics, are they? Or if you like, there is one tactic, but then there's not much of an ability to do anything after that. So I think in that respect, Roman flexibility is very much greater. Sometimes I can't think, to be honest, of anything like, for example, the Zulu army that was encountered in the 19th century. There clearly, Lord Chelmsford, the British commander, can't envisage these African savages being able to do anything other than charge, and doesn't, can't understand that there is a command structure there, there is an articulation there, but it is that articulation, I think, that gives the Zulus their edge at Isandlwana. I think also, actually, it's again childish contempt for people not thinking through who they're fighting. That gives them the edge. I mean, if you've got somebody who despises you, you actually have an advantage, don't you? But I can't think of anything particularly like that from the Roman period. Although, again, of course, Roman authors are not that interested in detailed battle description. So whether we get a fair presentation of what's happening on both sides is something that we might want to debate. Unfortunately, we only see, as they usually say, from one side of the hill. Yeah.
It's one of these things where each one opens up its own rabbit hole.
I'm afraid that's right. Yeah. I mean, and again, our problem is that we don't have the whole genre of military memoirs is not there. They in themselves, of course, are problematic. So if you look at memoirs from the Great War, I mean, I'm a big fan of the Western Front Association. It's my modern thing, so to speak. But if you look at the memoirs written at the time, and then the memoirs written in the late 20s, where people have been conditioned to say certain things, they are quite different from one another. And that I think, as a historian, is an irritation. But short of, Caesar pretends to be straight military memoirs, but they're not. The Bellum Hispaniense in the Caesarian corpus is the nearest I think we get in that sense. But tragically, of course, we don't have anyone writing, what was it like to fight Decebalus in Dacia? The Centurion's account and what have you are just not present. And I think it seems that they're not present not just because they've been lost in the passage of time, but that genre just didn't exist.
It didn't carry the same interest, or maybe these were the sorts of things that was common enough where it wasn't seen as interested in writing it down.
Yeah, and you don't get the ghost-written stuff. So, I mean, the most famous memoirs from the Napoleonic Wars, the memoirs of Rifleman Harris. Harris didn't write those; he dictated them. So he had to have someone who was interested enough to say, what was it like to be a rifleman in this period? Most of the Roman reading public, I would think, wouldn't give a monkey's cuss what it was like to be a legionary in Dacia. It's as simple as that.
Why would that be? I mean, in some respects, like you said before, every Roman or every person likes the idea of being a soldier. Every person sort of wants to be able to think, I could be there, I could be right at the front, and what would I do?
I think it's a curiosity that's still with us, isn't it? That you can admire the concept, but not like the nitty gritty. I think Rudyard Kipling captures this very well with his poem Tommy in the Barbarian ballads. So that everybody thinks it's great and heroic, but do you actually want a soldier in your pub? No, you don't. Yeah, so they're sort of rough, nasty people. And, just arguably, this is certainly something that's popped up in the scholarship in recent years. There is this notion of, if you like, a military Romanitas, what it is to be a Roman on the frontier, which is very much circulating around the army and such like, is not what it is to be a Roman in metropolitan Rome. Dio gets very upset about Septimius Severus's Danubian soldiers coming to Rome, and how they're sort of ghastly people, they all speak in horrible accents and such like. And the reverse is there, I think, with Ammianus Marcellinus. So Ammianus, a Greek, but very, very proud of being a Roman and part of the Roman Empire. He's gobsmacked by metropolitan Romans. He just thinks are awful people. They've let the side down appallingly in all sorts of ways. So those two things Perhaps the empire itself is growing up in different sorts of ways. There is an argument. I don't personally buy into it, but that Trajan's column has so much of non-battle scenes on it and such like, to try and show the metropolitan Roman that these people are just like you. I'm not sure I'd want to buy into that anyway. The next interesting question is who would get to see the scenes, because if you think about the mechanics of looking at Trajan's column, they're not very good.
In risk of stepping on Professor Laz's area of expertise, the PTSD, or the potential kind of, I think you wrote something on Roman PTSD, didn't you? The idea of people who have been on the front in the depths of the blood and guts, if you like, being in the middle of your town, as maybe is happening in modern day Russia with the people from the front coming back with all sorts of issues that they bring from the front, could be very corrosive to day-to-day society, which might also be why they had special kind of towns where everyone there had been on the front and therefore understood each other to some degree.
Yeah, although I think the colonii are start life as a reward. So you soldier, and then you get your farm, you get to live in a town. So I don't think that they're sort of worried in that regard. It is interesting that you can get medical discharge from the Roman army for mental reasons. So it's not that, that the Romans are blind to the fact that some of these things are happening. Now, I suspect a lot of that would be head trauma. Roman helmets are pretty good, but if you are bashed over the head very, very hard, sometimes bad things happened to the brain. There's no two ways about that. On the other hand, one of the things listed is weariness of life, tedium vitae, which I think, and again, it'd be nice to have a long chat with Christian about this. Some people think could mean depression, and depression, of course, is something that one finds with PTSD. It's very difficult to know. Interestingly as well, of course, one of the parts of the digest discusses this stuff, and it's these people. He says, "What do we do with people who try to commit suicide?" Now, technically, it sounds odd, doesn't it? But technically, this is a capital offence because you are depriving the emperor of a soldier. It's desertion, and desertion is a capital offence. Yeah. Hadrian says, we really need to see the circumstances here, and then he lists the various sorts of things which he thinks are mitigating in that regard. But interestingly, the mitigation is not total. So you aren't honourably discharged from the army, you are dishonourably discharged from the army, losing all the privileges you would have had as a veteran and such like, but you don't get to die. I think most of us would probably think living is better than dying. Not always the case, I think. If you've got a chronic and incurable disease, and again, I think quite a lot of these things, and again, this is listed, are diseases. So again, Roman medics accompany the army. The Romans are very good at patching people up, but they of course have no notion of microbiology. Gangrene is slow, is extremely painful, and you could easily see why in circumstances after a battle like that there would be some people who did actively seek to end their own life because their life was just intolerable. People for whom I would have every sympathy, but technically speaking, again, suicide is desertion. Is PTSD in general? I'm not so sure. I think this is a world where violence is endemic. The idea that you'd be shocked by what we've been talking about, the sheer visceral nature of things, I think some people will be. It's not the case that, but you would see death in all its misery every day of your life. I think people forget you would also see things like running sores mildly weeping eyes, sores that didn't heal and such like would have been an everyday occurrence in the Roman world. So, the grottiness of life would be on display all the time. People nowadays get very excited. I remember as a child being absolutely fascinated by the local butcher and seeing the carcasses hung on hooks at the back. It was a big treat for me about the age of 6 to go to the butcher. Maybe that says something about me, I don't know. But that sort of stuff was still out there. It's still out there in many countries to this day. That meat is displayed. I can remember going to Tunisia to show that the camel meat is fresh. Camels' heads are stuck on hooks outside the front door, and that's just part of life. The gladiatorial games are there, of course, and all of that sort of thing seems to me to militate quite strongly against large amounts of PTSD happening in the ancient world. I think I'm one of those people who do think that these things are more culturally conditioned than hardwired into us as human beings. But that's not to say it didn't happen from time to time, because as we all know, we are all also different. We don't come out the same mould, and our responses to things, even with cultural conditioning, can be different from time to time.
Yeah, I'm no doctor, but I have the impression I get is that PTSD is relative. So if everyone around you is going through the same thing, then what you have, the trauma isn't the same, or at least it wouldn't be described. No one describes life as a trauma, though it's full of difficulties. But as certain difficulties kind of migrate away, and life, we manage to somehow get rid of some of those difficulties, then when someone encounters those and it's unique, that's when the sort of
cultural conditioning works like that. So you see this with small children. Yeah? So if a small child falls over, the first thing they do is look to an adult to see what the reaction is. And if the reaction is one of horror, they will cry. If the reaction is not one of horror, very often they will just get up and keep going, because children are tougher than you imagine. So in a world where I think, yes, everybody's not so shocked by gruesome forms of death, you are unlikely to be shocked by them, which is not to say that the odd person will not be. So, we've always got to remember the exception that makes the rule in that respect, because not all men come out in the same direction. So it's out there, it's interesting, it's recognised by the Roman state to some degree. I can't see any way round the notion of tedium vitae being listed there as not being there. But nonetheless, I think it's one of the lower factors, and as I say, it is not regarded as we would regard it now as an entirely mitigating factor either.
If we move from the north to the east, so we're going from the barbarians to the much more civilised, organised armies, how different would the picture... So we painted the picture before of what warfare might look like on the northern front.
Yeah.
What are we looking at against the more organised armies of the east?
Well, we're looking at, in essence, a rather different world, aren't we? So certainly in the Imperial period, the main armies that in the principle would encounter, and even I think later on in terms of the serious soldiers, are cavalry armies. And the Romans are never particularly good at this sort of warfare. One of the reasons, of course, is the theatre. So out in that part of the world, you're not going to be able to secure your flanks. And that means that these armies can come pouring round you. Very often there will be a cloud of horse archers, and their aim is simply to pepper your formation until it starts to crumble. And then behind them there will be a very much heavier set of cavalrymen, often fully armoured, often their horses barded in full armour as well, and that's the hammer blow that's meant to finish you off. Chasing them, of course, is especially if you're an infantry-based army, is very, very hard, because if you advance however fast you can go, a man on a horse can go faster. So you can be dragged out of formation, which is extremely dangerous in itself. If you do this several times, you will exhaust yourself, simply making the problem worse. And then you will get hit by the heavy element of this. And that sort of step warfare, I think, goes well through into the medieval period. So the tactics used by Tamerlane, by the Mongols and such like, are very, very similar. And that these armies are highly organised. I mean, there are people there providing extra arrows so that the horse archers don't run out of arrows. These people can manoeuvre feigned retreats and such like, of course, a staple for such armies in that regard. And it's maybe why we have such an impasse most of the time. Infantry in that part of the world, usually I think not as good as Roman infantry, but the Romans are let down by their cavalry arm. That gradually, of course, grows in the later Roman period, and it's not the case that the late Roman army is hopeless. It by no means is hopeless.
So what gives them a fighting chance? Because what you've described there seems an impossibility for a heavily armed infantry army to deal with, and in Genghis Khan's period, they couldn't deal with them. All the armies that were kind of infantry based were just completely overrun. What allows the Romans to compete in this?
I think again, to some degree, this is where we think about strategy as well as tactics. Sort of fighting where you want to fight across the empire. I mean, west as well as east. The growth of fortification. So, horses can't knock down walls. And the awkward thing about fortifications is you can advance beyond them, but then you have a potential logistics problem yourself. If you've not taken out strong points, how are you going to get home? How are you going to feed people? Things like that. But also, of course, as time goes by, one of the things about the Romans, I think, is that they are not a proud people in military terms. So the weapons that we've looked at, that both the Pilum and the Gladius here, are likely to have had precursors in Iberian weaponry. So the Romans have come along and they thought, well, that's quite good. We should have those as well, rather than just ignoring them and hoping they'd go away. So in the same way, as time goes by, the number of Roman cavalrymen increase. They also start to have heavy cavalrymen. They also, to some degree, have a few archers. They even have some camels. So there is a growth of these things. There is also a theory which I think is quite a good one in some ways, which says that, combative armies, there is a convergence of arms as time goes by. So again, when Rome faces off against these armies, they take on some of the Roman organisational forms. The Romans take on some of the equipment and stuff. If we look at the later Roman army, yes, there are many more Germanic people in that army, but their equipment and the equipment of their opponents, again, there is the barbarians are also picking up ideas from the Romans, that there is more convergence as time goes by.
But the difference is the Romans have many enemies.
Yeah.
And the Germans basically, or the Germanic peoples, have one big enemy, which is the Romans. So the Romans are having to evolve in different parts of the empire to deal in very different kinds of ways. So if an army moves from the east and they happen to have cavalry and camels, how does that?
I don't think you'd ever move a camel unit, because that would be crazy. Actually, as time goes by, you get less moving right across the empire than you used to do. So the first century, I think it is fair to say that the idea that you can move around is there. Another century on, I think Danubian troops could go to the Rhineland. Troops from the Rhineland can come to Britain and such like. But sending people all the way across the empire is less likely to happen, I think.
Is there no evidence from Hadrian's Wall of people coming all the way from Libya? Or?
Well, there are certain groups there. Now, one of the things we've got to be a bit careful about here as well is recruitment practices. So when the Romans raise an auxiliary unit, it normally has an ethnic or a racial tag sitting there, the first cohort of Tungrians or whatever. And they've been raised there. But as far as we can see, there is no depot system. So as people start retiring or dying at the top end, they need new soldiers. But those new soldiers are likely to come from the locality. So there's no necessary reason for them to be Tungrians anymore. And indeed, we have some epigraphy from Britain, we have it from elsewhere, of people serving who are identifiably from a different. There's a man who's from the Brigantes, for example, serving in a Thracian unit on the Antonine War. And this is not out of the ordinary in any sense. This is, and in fact, it happens all the time, doesn't it? So in World War II, for example, my grandfather, who was born in Lancaster, wound up in a Yorkshire-named regiment, much to his chagrin, but nonetheless he did, because that's who needed the soldiers at the time. So, we shouldn't be surprised about that. Now, very occasionally, I think, certainly the Hamian archers who are stationed at Carveran. How Carveran is an awkward site on Hadrian's Wall as to whether it's part of the system or not. Now, they have a very specific skill of fighting with composite bows. And going back to Homer, Odyssey this time, the drawing and use of those bows is a specific skill. It's more than likely that unit was one of the few units that Rome would have wanted to keep a flow of recruits from the original place, because they had this specific skill. But for most auxiliary units, I think, that need not be the case. There could be ghosts. So, Bud Oswald, again on Hadrian's Wall, quite interesting. There you've got cohorts of Dacians. They're there well after the Dacian War. I suspect it's a Sika, the small curved sword. It might be meant to be a falx, the large curved battle scythe, is depicted on there as a sort of regimental badge, if you like. So they're sort of proud of their origins in a way. But whether the people who are being recruited into that are Dacians, I think is up for grabs. And my guess is most of them probably in a couple of generations weren't.
So in time, you end up with potentially a complete replacement, or at least a large majority replacement of the original.
Yeah.
If we think about forts, because you're talking about forts on the east playing a fairly important part in warfare, when we look at a fort's placement, what can that really tell us about what they were trying to do with that fort? So in the modern day, America, for example, it builds forts in safe locations, and then it has like a forward operating base. Yeah. But you don't build a fort in enemy's territory, and you don't build a fort right on the border of enemy's territory. You build, obviously today there's more long-range weapons, etc., but you tend to build forts in fairly safe locations, and then you have a series of less and less permanent kind of forward operating bases until you're in full enemy territory. And I wonder, when fighting, especially on the east, to what? But even here in England, where are they deciding to put these forts? What is, or is there any sort of coherence as to where they're building forts and for what reason? It could be, for example, like in Chester, it's maybe for local dominance and maybe tax collection, and maybe in Hadrian's Wall this is like a hard border, and in the east, I just wonder if there's any sort of coherence or strategy or tactic to where forts are being stationed.
I do think forts probably have two linked roles, don't they? One is a pure military role. Another one will be sort of civilian administration, keep an eye on people sort of role. The other thing, of course, to remember is the neurons, if you like, of the Roman Empire are its roads. So having forts on roads, making sure those roads work, that you can move people along them safely, guarding in particular nodal points where there are crossroads and such like, is going to be a key part of what Rome is doing. I think by and large, you do get forts on the frontier. So they are marking out a boundary or fairly close to where the boundary is. But then you do find them, I think, guarding these key pits of the transportational network. So making sure that you can use rivers as well, of course. If you can put something on a boat in antiquity, you will. It's much faster, it's much cheaper than putting it on a wagon or something like that. And there are no animals to feed either, which is another bonus. So putting down, if you like, and again, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Is this an army of occupation, or is it just part? Do we regard the local police force as a sort of governmental army of occupation, or are they just there? Yep. What people felt about the Roman army, particularly if I'm right in saying that, there's an awful lot of local recruitment. So your son, does he join the Roman army? Does he not join the Roman army? Your daughter, can she marry a Roman soldier? Should she marry a Roman soldier? All sorts of interesting things like this. And again, there's a stone from Lancaster, actually, of a man who was a Curian, so a minor officer in a cavalry regiment. And that stone was found near Lancaster. Clearly, this man has retired from the army and he's farming. Now, is he an incomer, or is he somebody who joined that unit as a local and has then got some money, bought some land, and he's farming locally? The dedication on his stone is to the local god. Stone is written in Latin, of course. All sorts, again, of interesting crossover things are going on there. But there is a mile of difference, isn't there, from, say, South Armagh in the 1970s and the British Army, and the British Army in Aldershot. And which one of those is right? And whether, of course, there's a uniform response is a different matter as well, isn't it? So some parts of the Roman Empire may never have wanted the Romans to be around. And their serving in the Roman army and going on patrol might have been quite a hairy thing on a regular basis. In other parts of the world, they're just part of the scenery. And they're people you can sell stuff to. They're a useful market. They keep down bandits. Big problem in a world where there's no real organised police force. So just that feel about this is important. So I think forts can be, they've got a military purpose, they've got an admin purpose, and arguably they have a policing purpose as well.
So maybe we can think of Spain as a more kind of relaxed place to be stationed, and then maybe, Barbarian or, the north of England, maybe a slightly less relaxed place.
And again, in the countryside, it depends. I mean, Spain, we know a provincial governor is just killed by bandits, but whether those bandits have what we would call a political motive, I think is questionable. I think they probably just see a rich Roman, think there's some pickings to be had here. And after all, that is happening in Italy. Pliny, again, one of his letters, he sets up a friend to join the Roman army, gives him a fairly substantial sum of money, and he totters off to get on a boat to go off and join his unit, and he's never seen again. Now, of course, he could have done a runner with the money, yeah? That's something actually sometimes the literature overlooks. But, it's also quite likely that he just wandered up into the countryside, was hit on the head by someone, and they stole the money. Again, we live, of course, in a world, don't we, where we are used to good law and order on a regular basis. When I go back to Stoke-on-Trent this evening, the last thing that will be crossing my mind to worry about, I mean, there are various things to worry about, but one of them is not being mugged on the way and being killed, because the policing of this country is such that is almost inconceivable. It's not entirely inconceivable, it's almost inconceivable. The Roman world, I think, once you step outside of a town, there is potential trouble. The countryside is a frightening place. It's full of bad people, it's full of large, nasty animals, and they're all out to get you.
Well, this leads into the question of how was money moved around the empire, because obviously nowadays we have banking, so it's slightly less profitable to boink someone over the head because they're not likely to have much more than a piece of plastic in their pockets. But in the Roman period, I mean, there's huge amounts of money being shipped all over the empire. Everyone's being paid. I mean, if you're in the army for 20 years and you're trying to save, this money is physical and is being stored somewhere. Yep. So it's hugely more profitable to boink someone on the head, and you're much more likely to come away with a substantial amount of real money. What's the logistics of it? Do we know anything about the logistics of all of this? Because it's a huge amount of weight.
It is a huge amount of weight, I agree, and sadly less than we'd like to, I think is fair to say. Now, where is it being stored? I mean, Roman soldiers have compulsory stoppages for savings. That makes sense in all sorts of ways. I mean, modern experience will suggest that very many soldiers, given money, will spend it in all sorts of very dubious ways that we need not to go into here. But, if you come out the Roman army, if you go in at about 18 to 20 and you serve your 25 years, you'll come out as a trained individual, still physically in pretty good nick. And if you've got, no money or anything, banditry might well seem a good career path. So if you're the Roman emperor, that's not good news at all. So giving these lads savings, making sure they can set themselves up, so they're going to be good, upright citizens and a useful set of reservists, of course, rather than a pain in the backside, makes a lot of sense. Now, those savings go in the strong room in the fort concerned. Right in the middle, so physically safe, underneath the standards, which of course are semi-divine, so there's supernatural protection as well as physical protection, so that sits there. How do you pay them? Now, that's the one that I think is really interesting, and as far as I know, nobody really knows. Certainly from the spread of coin, we see Roman soldiers were paid in Specie, and it was in small denomination coins. So that would have to be transported. I would again think that putting it on a boat, if you could, would make a lot of sense. You've got less chance of banditry, perhaps a larger chance of it going down. But, most Roman sailors are cowards. They crawl along the coast. But taking that overland, very slow moving. Some Roman vehicles is good, but very often it's poor. I mean, the tablets from Vindolanda talk about broken axles all the time, and that sometimes Roman roads perhaps are a little bit overrated. They're very much, to be fair, they're really designed for people marching in hobnail boots on, and anything else is a bonus.
Taking money down there is probably quite noisy as well.
Noisy, slow, very visible, very obvious. And you presumably would have to pay off quite a lot of people to march up and down with said money. So there is certainly an awkwardness there. Again, of course, one of the interesting impacts of Rome on the frontier is that you were quite often dealing with areas which weren't previously monetised. To make anything out of these new people, you're going to have to start accepting these little shiny circles of metal. So arguably the Roman army helps to monetize the economy. I think it is fair to say a monetized economy usually works more efficiently than a non-monetized economy. It need not be the case. I mean, after all, Mesoamerican cultures didn't have coins. Ancient Egypt didn't have coins, but their economy seemed to have worked.
Doesn't make it more efficient, though.
No. So I think in terms of just providing a general means of exchange and getting people used to this, potentially having the army there's a drain in some respects, obviously, in having the Roman army on your patch. And nobody in the Roman world wants soldiers anywhere near them because they might get billeted on them, and that's something that everybody is deeply against. But there is a market, and you can make money out of these people, and no doubt quite a lot of locals did make money out of these people. And then if they're making money out of, literally money out of them, that money presumably has to spread, otherwise it's going to be of no use. I mean, it is bullion, of course. I mean, at one level you could weigh it out and melt it down. Bit dangerous melting down things with the Roman emperor's head on, but you would like to think that there is a serious boost to the economy potentially there.
Is there any chance that they split it where they gave them spending money on the one hand, and then there was like an account for when they retired? So I mean, that would make much more practical sense. That there would be a book somewhere, maybe behind in Rome or somewhere that's not on a frontier, which with...
It's a very interesting idea. I'm not sure it will work. I mean, certainly we know that in the reign of the Emperor Domitian, when there's an attempted, it fails very quickly, mutiny on the Rhine, it is the savings accounts which are used to sort of prime pump the rebellion. to start with. So that the implication there is that stuff's there. Though I did have some years ago now a doctoral student, and she argued, I think quite well, that certainly in the Republican period there were records about certain length of service and such like. So if those records were there, you could then say, well, this money is owing to us. That said, Roman soldiers, to some degree rightly, are always suspicious of the centre and whether it's going to stump up or not. So I think quite a lot of squaddies might have wanted to see the silver in the box in the HQ, rather than notionally there at Rome that they could somehow claim to discover there was a very clever reason why they couldn't have it.
I was also wondering, once we're talking about how Rome spread its power, that money could have been one of the ways in which annexation could have presented itself. I mean, I think the American example today is very instructive, where obviously the scale that we have it today has probably never been seen before in human history. But the idea that America has a huge amount of leverage over other parts of the world in which it has no military power over, purely because it has the ability to disrupt trade and cause problems along those lines, and even quite recently potentially threaten allies with economic consequences if they don't do what they want them to do. To what degree were the Romans using that as a kind of mechanism of control? Because we see quite a lot that the Romans have money making their way. We see money far into Scotland beyond the Romans' borders. We see money all the way in Japan, as far as I understand it. So money makes its way far out. And if it's doing that, there must have been quite an intense trade all around the empire on its peripheries. And to what degree do the Romans kind of weaponize that?
Weaponize, I don't know. Certainly you're right about the volume of trade. And again, very often, of course, outside the empire, you find a disproportionate number of early coins because they have a higher silver content. I mean, they are being used as ingots, essentially. And if you're outside the empire, of course, you can insist on that in a way that it might be quite dangerous to say, I won't accept this recent money here. Pliny gets very excited about this. He says we waste all this money. We have a trade deficit with India, wasting all this money on pepper and such like. I can't think of any time the empire tries to turn the screw on that sort of person. The reason I suspect might be that those who rule in these areas are not necessarily those who are trading. Consequently, you don't have the same sort of leverage on these people. Now, I suppose if you screwed down very hard and the merchant class got very annoyed for a long period of time, you might have a management problem sitting there, but you're not going to hit the people at the top of the tree straight away in that regard. Bribery is certainly out there. There's no two ways about that. So sort of trying to buy your way, which sometimes successful, sometimes less successful, is certainly part of Roman diplomacy and soft power projection. But I can't think of anywhere, if somebody's got an idea of this, I'd love to know about it, because it would be a great thing to think about.
Maybe it possibly happened more locally, because like you say, the Romans aren't in control of who's using the money, and they don't have a swift system to shut down.
No.
But if I have a fort, I can instruct my soldiers where if said people don't play ball, we're going to buy our stuff off these people instead. So maybe if you're a local commander, you could use that.
Yeah, and certainly there's at least one instance on the Vindolanda tablets of somebody noting that the price is high or something. Now, again, part of the problem, I think, with the Vindolanda tablets is what we don't know is whether the trade that's marked out on them is an internal market within the army, or whether they're dealing, I suspect they are dealing with local traders. So A Trectus the beer man, for example. Is a Trectus the beer man the regimental brewer? He might be. Or is he the man who is coming down from the hills with barrels of the good stuff to flog to the soldiers, most of whom, of course, are coming from a Northern European background and probably would much prefer beer to anything else that they're going to get. And we just don't know. Certainly, I think, there is a sort of sense in the Vindolanda tablets that people are looking for value for money. And that might mean that there is as a quite active market. And as you rightly say, one way of pushing certain people back into line might be to say, well, you're not behaving yourself, are you? So we're not interested in patronising you. That, I suppose, would depend quite a lot on what percentage of any person's trade was with the army as opposed to anything else. My inclination would be to say that sheer physical coercion would be the way that the army dealt with such problems rather than an economic squeeze. But I can't say that that's not a possibility.
Or maybe both.
Yeah.
Sort of the... if we zoom out a little bit, and I know we've covered this to some degree, but how war-hungry was the Roman army? Did it have, a bit like the military-industrial complex today, where there's huge amounts of profit being made along the whole chain? Yeah. To what degree did it have its own self-perpetuating inertia? Or to what degree was it just an instrument of an emperor, and then you get someone like Hadrian who goes, we stop here?
I think Roman soldiers like to be winners. So, as we said, Hadrian is remarkably unpopular emperor. Not just because of giving up territory, but he certainly doesn't help. What we find in the 3rd century is that, in some ways, the genius of the Emperor Augustus was to take the Roman army out of politics. In the 3rd century, the army comes back into politics with a vengeance. And to be emperor, you have to be seen to be a military winner. You usually have to be on the field of battle, and it doesn't take very much. Only one thing going wrong will be enough for the army to turn on you. So in that regard, I think, the idea of a conquering ideology is always there.
Is there a change where, in the beginning, conquest funds the system, and then towards the end, the kind of peoples they're conquering don't really have much to fund the system with? So the nature of what the army becomes useful for is very different.
The answer, I think, is again probably yes and no. So some areas that Rome conquers can be quite rich in mineral resources. And one thinks particularly perhaps of Asturias in Spain, where there are big gold mines. The Romans know about those gold mines. Arguably, they have to take Cantabria next door, which is very poor in resources, really, because they'd be left again with a geographical mess if they were to leave Cantabria as an enclave. Dacia, of course, is extremely rich in gold as well, but also extremely isolated. So when you've gone in there, and again, of course, you might say that the Emperor Trajan's hand was forced to some degree, particularly in annexation. You're then left with this enormous salient, which only lasts about, well, I say only, but it lasts 100 years, which is short by Roman terms. So there, you're abandoning something, probably because you can't hang on to it anymore, frankly, but was financially quite valuable. On the other hand, Britain, which is poor in mineral resources, let's be honest, in Roman terms, we haven't got anything to offer the Roman Empire.
I thought they came for the tin.
There's plenty of tin in Spain. You've no need to go to Britain for tin. I mean, it's nice to have it. Don't get me wrong. If I was to have a consuming hatred of you, I could pick up that sword and run you through, and then I could nick your credit cards. And that'd be sort of nice bonus, yeah. But it'd not be the reason I was doing it. Britain, I think, it must be its strategic position. And the Romans could have let go of Britain, but they hang on to it to the bitter end, which is really quite interesting in a way. And the only reason I can think of them for doing that is that the position of the island sort of acts as a filter for Germanic pirates which means it's much harder for them to get down into nice parts of the empire, the south of France, Spain and such like. And therefore, although the island never turns into profit for Rome in a financial sense, it actually in strategic terms makes a lot of sense to keep hold of it. So I think this very much depends on local circumstances. There are some places which are rich but strategically weak. There are other places which are poor but strategically strong. And I think Rome's approach to these places is very much focused on what the overall picture is rather than one specific part of that picture.
I hadn't really considered the naval component here. But how big was the naval component in the Roman story after they kind of control the whole Mediterranean basin?
Well, the Roman fleet's still. I mean, there are fleets at Ravenna. There is a fleet at Misenum near Naples. Tacitus mentions both of these, and he sort of says they are to guard Italy, and certainly the Dalmatian coast, lots of little islands. You're not talking obviously about big fleets from enemy powers, but there is a need to stop piracy, and in most educated Romans' minds, there would have been the pirate problems of the late Republic. These things could get out of hand, so having those soldiers there would be important. With Britain, the Classis Britannica, curiously, HQ seems to be Boulogne for most of the time, but is clearly working to make sure that the English Channel works, to keep those chains open to Britain, but also probably to stop piracy in a variety of forms, particularly piracy from the Germanic side of the frontier, bouncing down and then through and out. There are big riverine fleets both on the Danube and the Rhine, and those are obviously being used for patrolling, but I think they'll also be used a lot for logistics. Again, having these little boats, the Germans very good at reconstructing them. So sort of small boats, 30 oars a side, something like that, possibly a catapult sitting on one end of it. Just like river patrol boats in more modern times, going up and down. I think a very useful asset for the Romans on those frontiers. There are fleets in the Eastern Med as well. Again, there are parts of the Eastern Med, bits of Cilicia, for example, notorious for piracy, and in fact notorious for law and order in general. I mean, whether Cilicia, just like the northwest frontier of India, was ever really part of the Roman Empire is an interesting question.
So in the 19th and 20th century, they had these. There was this idea where you had empires based on maritime empires, and you had empires that were kind of land empires. Yeah. Does Rome fit that kind of?
I think Rome is a Mediterranean empire with bolt-ons. So before Caesar, it was a Mediterranean empire. And then Caesar has to do some conquering, so he goes and does some conquering. And then arguably the Emperor Claudius also needs to do some conquering, so he takes in Britain. But if you were to chop off Gaul and you were to chop off Britain, the rest, I mean, what is the locus of the Roman Empire? It is the pond that is the Mediterranean, isn't it? So it's a Mediterranean empire. And it's one where if you are the only power, so to speak, and again, Rome's main rival in this part of the world has no maritime access to the Mediterranean at all. So you don't need a big navy.
Well, it is interesting now that you mention it in that kind of frame, that the Romans are the first ones to go north rather than east. Because if you think about Alexander and all the other previous conquerors, I mean, the reason why the barbarians are barbarians is because no one's really bothered to empire the place. Is there a reason why the Romans decided to do that as opposed to go east like everyone else did?
Well, I think in the first instance for Caesar, this is dictated by politics. So his main rival, of course, Pompey, has gone east. He's the man who brings Asia Minor into the Roman orbit, really. And he isn't going to let his political rival go anywhere near there. So Caesar is stuck. He engineers his command in Gaul, of course, and he needs a war. So now, depending on what you think about Ariovistus and those dangers. Either that's engineered by Caesar to make sure he has his war, or he exploits it to make sure he gets his war afterwards. And it's the only area that's available to him. And consequently, that's where he fights his war. With Claudius, I think life is a little bit different, obviously. But again, arguably, you might want to say, where else is there for him to go? Conquering the Sahara, not so good. Attack Parthia. Well, yeah, but remember, he comes to power in very, very dubious circumstances. So he needs a success, and it needs to be a surefire success. So you fight the Parthians. You might lose. Well, game over. Yeah, you've lost. But even if you draw, that's not going to be good enough. Yeah, especially not after the great hoo-ha with Augustus and bringing the standards back and all the rest of it. In fact, a draw is as good as losing. Yeah. Attack the Germans. Well, again, people, I think, sometimes forget the paranoia the Romans have about Germans and then pouring into Gaul, pouring into Italy and such like. So why not go for Britain? There are lots of good reasons to go for Britain. Julius Caesar failed there, so I can be better than Julius Caesar. Well, that's going to play really, really well. Yeah. But the other nice one is there's that comforting 20 miles of water between Britain and the rest of the Roman Empire. So if it goes wrong, well, actually, to be honest with you, if it goes wrong, it's curtains anyway, yeah? But if it goes wrong, you've got more chance of pulling away. You've not antagonized, you've stirred up a minor wasp's nest rather than a huge hornet's nest.
Because what confuses me is that obviously as you go in latitude, the way you live becomes less and less transferable because it gets colder and colder. Yep. And the benefit of going east is your way of life is transferable in a way that it isn't. That's always kind of the weird thing.
Apart from the Fertile Crescent, there is a desert in the way. All right, so if you don't go down the Fertile Crescent, you can't go. I mean, that's why Alexander, when he goes to Egypt, has to go all the way back up again to go round and down. Yeah, you just can't go across the desert. And as I say, the Parthians are out there, and they're a somewhat ramshackle empire, to be fair. But nonetheless, they're not people to mess with. So this is why there's lots and lots of squabbling about Armenia. So Armenia is the way from one empire to another. And both empires are pretty clear that it ain't going to be part of the other sides. So the Armenians either are smart and play both sides against the middle, or just suffer from both sides. Yeah. And curiously, it's Nero who brokers a fairly good deal, which is then only broken really in the reign of Trajan. Now, Trajan is a guy, I think, with an Alexander complex, and he goes for Armenia. He in some ways, turns it into a province by trickery, but and then he marches down the Fertile Crescent, but he can't hang on to it. I mean, there are rebellions absolutely everywhere, and Hadrian, I think, is faced with having to give this stuff up. I mean, interestingly, of course, what we're told is he would also have given up Dacia, given half a chance, but Trajan had encouraged so many Romans to go there that, this really would have been, I think, the tipping point where he would have lost control of the empire himself. Yeah. On that note, Will, I think it's possibly time to call it a day, isn't it?
Well, thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much for the time. Lots of it. I very much appreciate it. And
not at all.
It's fascinating, as always, talking to you. And fingers crossed we can pick this up another time. So
yeah.
Thank you very, very much.